We begin with the quiet question that has haunted thinkers for millennia. What is consciousness, and what is the relationship between that inner light and the body that carries us through the day? The project we are stepping into is not a single moment of discovery, but a long, winding conversation across cultures, disciplines, and centuries. It is a conversation that begins in the ancient world, travels through the meditative spaces of Indian philosophy, moves through medieval debates, surges in the early modern period with Descartes and his successors, and then branches into the scientific and philosophical turnings of the 19th and 20th centuries, and into our own present conversations about mind, brain, and machine. What follows is an in-depth tour of foundations, the history, the major positions, the core arguments and their counter-arguments, and the way these debates shape our thinking about knowledge, reality, and what it means to be a being who can question, imagine, feel, and act. From the outset, it is useful to recognize a set of persistent questions that reappear in different guises across cultures. Is consciousness fundamentally a property of a non-material soul, or is it an emergent feature of physical systems? If it is immaterial, how can mind and body causally interact? If mind is one thing and body another, what is the status of the external world as we experience it? Can we ever know the true nature of consciousness, or are we trapped behind a veil of appearances that our own cognition builds? The answers have been diverse, ranging from dualistic separations to monistic unities, to emergent novelties that crack the door open to new kinds of explanations. The path is neither linear nor uniform. There are long stretches where a position dominates, then fierce challenges that push the field into new configurations. Across cultures, but with a distinctly Western and Indian intellectual lineage among the most heavily traversed routes, early thinkers began by asking what it means to know and what it means to be. In the West, a tradition begins in Greece with the problem of the soul and its powers, a problem that later becomes the study of mind and consciousness. In Indian philosophy, from the Upanishads through various schools, consciousness is not a mere byproduct of matter but a central category, sometimes understood as both the ground of experience and the ultimate reality, revealing itself through contemplation and meditative practice. These early streams together set the stage for a persistent structure of debate. Is mind distinct from matter, or is it, in some sense, the same thing viewed under different lights? And if it is distinct, by what mechanism might it affect matter, and how could we possibly know the truth of either side? Let us begin with Plato, whose thought offers a vivid and instructive narrative about the soul and its faculties. Plato's tripartite schema, reason, spirit, and appetite, invites us to see consciousness as more than a single interior stream. The rational part is planned to govern, the spirited part to defend and to respond with resolve, while the appetitive part desires what is agreeable in the body and the world. This division does not merely map onto a psychology of temperament, it frames a political and ethical psychology as well. The soul, in Plato's account, is not a blind passenger in the body, but a disciplined agent with the capacity to know, to judge, and to choose. In the Republic and the Phaedrus, one senses that the life of the mind is not a mere sequence of sensory impressions, but an ascent toward truth, a movement of the soul to align itself with the good. The allegory of the cave, with its prisoners watching shadows and mistaking appearances for reality, dramatizes the distinction between appearance and essence. The soul's ascent out of the cave toward the light of the forms is a description of cognition in its most ideal sense. The mind's capacity to grasp something that the senses cannot immediately disclose. Plato's thought, in this sense, is a window into a form of dualism, but not the crude separation of a ghost in a machine. It is a more subtle assertion. The mind, the soul, has its own order and its own work. Yet even as Plato emphasizes the ascent of the rational soul, he remains deeply concerned with how a human life is ordered, and the moral and political dimensions of inward life are never far from the philosophical. In Plato, we see a deep conviction that conscious life has a structure, an architecture of faculties, that can be trained, harmonized, and oriented toward the good. The mind's inner architecture bears on how one experiences the world and chooses among possible lives. Consciousness is not merely passive sensation, but a form of life that requires cultivation. As we follow the thread into Indian philosophy, we encounter a different yet resonant claim. Consciousness or awareness is not simply a byproduct of matter, it is tied to a more fundamental reality and, in many traditions, is the locus of knowledge itself. In the Upanishads and evolving Advaita Vedanta, consciousness, often described as pure awareness or Atman, becomes the ground of experience. The world is not necessarily denied. Rather, it is read through a framework in which subject and object are interwoven in a way that challenges naive materialist assumptions. The classic koan-like maneuver of Advaita is to ask how something as distinct as consciousness could arise from inert matter, or how a body could carry around a continuous sense of first-person experience unless consciousness is not just a surface property, but a fundamental dimension of reality. This is not simply a metaphysical claim, it is a methodological one. To understand the mind rightly, one must scrutinize the structure of experience itself. In the Indian traditions, the mind is often considered a turning point toward the issue of liberation and knowledge. However, the mind is not seen as the last word on being. In some schools, consciousness is the solvent of illusion rather than a mere feature of a body. In others, it remains tied to a set of cognitive processes that can be studied and refined. The cross-cultural resonance here is striking. Both the Greek and Indian traditions insist that consciousness is not simply something that happens to matter. Rather, there is a deep congruence between how we come to know and what it means to be a given kind of being. The mind is not an inert appendage. It carries an order of its own, the order of reasoning, self-reflection, desire, and intention, yet it must be understood within a broader picture that includes ethical and spiritual dimensions. As medieval thinkers pick up these questions, the mind-body problem acquires new texture. Augustine of Hippo, blending Christian theology with Platonic psychology, asks how an immaterial mind can know a material world and how sin and grace might reverberate within that interior space. The medieval synthesis often leans toward a form of hylomorphism inherited from Aristotle. The soul is the form, the body the matter, and together they constitute the living being. The mind is not a separate eternity detached from the body, but its powers are often described as immaterial rather than purely physical, and yet these powers function within a created physical framework. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd, carry forward the Latin medieval tasks of reconciling faith with reason, insisting that there is a continuous thread between intellect and the material world, yet they remain open to robust distinctions between primary activities of the soul and the physiological processes of the body. The medieval period thus offers a bridge, a mature articulation that the mind's life is not reducible to bodily movements, even as it must be instantiated within a material world. With Descartes, we arrive at one of the most famous lines in the history of philosophy, a line that would set the terms of the modern debate for centuries. Descartes begins from radical doubt. If I am to know anything, I must first secure the certainty of my own existence as a thinking thing. Cogito, ergo sum, becomes not simply a proposition but a method, a way of trimming away what can be doubted to reveal a core that cannot. The mind for Descartes is a distinct thinking substance, a res cogitans, while the body is a distinct but non-thinking substance, a res extensa. The famous mind-body dichotomy is thus born as a philosophical problem, not merely as a theoretical claim. If mind and body are fundamentally different kinds of things, how do they interact? The problem of interaction, sometimes attributed to the pinhead in the pineal gland, becomes the central technical challenge for Cartesian philosophy. If the two substances are so radically different, what account could possibly explain how a mental event can cause a bodily movement and how a physical change can alter a mental state? Descartes' wax example crystallizes a crucial insight, one that has echoed through centuries of debate. In the second meditation, he asks us to consider a lump of wax taken from a hillside. When it sits as solid wax, it feels and looks one way to the senses, but when the wax is heated, it changes in scent, shape, texture, and even in its electrical properties. Yet Descartes argues the understanding of the wax, the mind's grasp of its essence as extended, flexible, and subject to modification by the intellect rather than by the senses, persists despite these changes. The senses, he contends, mislead. The mind, acting through clear and distinct ideas, apprehends the essence of the wax as extended matter. In this moment, Descartes dramatizes a broader question. Is conscious experience a mere collection of sensory appearances, or is it a rational act, a mental grasp of the underlying form that remains stable even as appearances shift? The wax example is not a mere demonstration of sense deception. It is a defense of rationalist epistemology and a meditation on how we know the world through mind and judgment rather than through passions and appearances alone. In the same arc, the question of mind-body interaction becomes a technical problem for Cartesian dualism. If the mind is non-material, how can it influence a material body? If the body follows the laws of physics, what guidance does mind provide? Descartes attempts to locate the site of interaction in the pineal gland, distinctively a point where inner and outer life might intersect, has the flavor of a first practical model rather than a fully worked theory. The more robust consequence of Descartes' framework is not merely a separation, but a call for a new understanding of causality, one in which the mental and the physical speak different languages yet must coordinate their influence to produce action, sensation, and experience. The problem of interaction becomes the hinge around which centuries of debate would turn. Is there a way to reconcile a mind that thinks or a soul that wills with a body that moves and decays? The Cartesian moment also sparks an enduring anti-dualist current. The post-Cartesian critique would grow from different directions. To say that a strictly immaterial mind cannot causally affect matter invites questions about the status of mental states. If every effect has a physical cause, a naturalist reading of mental life seems to push us toward reducing mental states to brain states or to something physically describable. Spinoza offers a dramatic alternative, a form of monism that refuses to pretend there are two separate substances at all. For Spinoza, mind and body are two attributes of a single substance, God or nature, with one order of thought and one order of extension. He writes in effect that the mind is the idea of the body, and the body is the mode of the mind's attribute. There is no genuine separation, only a different way of understanding the same underlying reality. This is not just a clever leveling of categories. It is a rigorous attempt to maintain rational unity while still accounting for the richness of human experience. Leibniz, who comes right after Spinoza in this thread of rationalist monism, introduces the notion of monads, fundamental, non-interacting centers of force that nevertheless appear to interact in the grand theater of the universe. In his system, the apparent causal interaction between minds and bodies is a reflected harmony, pre-established by God rather than a direct physical contact. The mind-body problem thus shifts from a question of how two substances touch to a broader metaphysical choreography. The mind and the body are manifestations of a single, prearranged order of reality. This is a turn away from the crude mechanistic image, toward a more subtle account in which mental phenomena have their own laws, ideally consistent with physical reality but not reducible to it. The medieval and early modern experiments with psychology were not so much discarded as recast in more sophisticated terms. How could one talk about consciousness without impoverishing it by reducing it to mechanism? The 19th century adds another crucial layer through Immanuel Kant, whose Copernican turn recasts the problem from how the world is to how the mind structures experience. Kant argues that we do not passive receive a world of sense data that arrives into a blank organ. Instead, the mind actively organizes sensory input using categories of understanding, such as causal relation, unity, and substance. The world as we know it, the phenomenal world, is not simply given to us, it is produced by the brain's organizing structures. The famous line is not simply about epistemology. It has direct consequences for metaphysics and the mind-body problem. If space, time, and causal relations are not empirical givens but forms of intuition applied to sensory data, then the mind is not merely a passive receiver of information. It is a co-architect of experience. Kant thereby reframes dualism and materialism into a problem of how subjective structures shape the possibility of knowledge, linking the mind's architecture to what we take to be the objective world. The same century, however, pushes in other directions. The late 18th and 19th centuries see a flourishing of idealist and materialist campaigns. German idealism, as represented by Fichte, Schelling, and especially Hegel, situates consciousness within a vast rational dynamic that moves from abstract self-consciousness toward the world as spirit comes to self-awareness. For Hegel, consciousness is a process of development, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that unfolds in history and culture, a philosophy that treats mind as a historic and social phenomenon. The upshot is that consciousness is not a private, isolated phenomenon, but something that grows in interaction with institutions, language, culture, and the collective medium of meaning. Yet even in this expansive, almost romantic account, mind remains inseparable from the world it knows. Consciousness is always a form of knowing that can only be understood by following the development of thought and history. In this period, the Cartesian legacy meets new materials with the emergence of science as a rigorous enterprise. The scientific image of the mind develops as physiology, psychology, and neuroscience begin to chart the brain's functions. The 19th century moves toward a more naturalized picture of the mind, but the question of whether mind is reducible to matter remains contested. This is the moment where emergentist tendencies begin to appear. What if consciousness is a higher level of organization that cannot be fully explained by lower-level physics and chemistry, but nevertheless supervenes on them? The emergentist voice is a bridge between the old dichotomies and the new scientific possibilities. It is the belief that complex systems can exhibit properties that their parts do not possess, and that these properties may be causally efficacious while still grounded in physical interactions. This is not a denial of material causes, but a claim about the novelty of organized complexity. As we move into the 20th century, the philosophical terrain becomes new and dynamic through the rise of behaviorism, a movement that challenges introspective methods and treats mental states as epiphenomena or as theoretical commitments unnecessary to explain observable behavior. Behaviorism is not simply a reduction of mind to skull and reflex. It is an insistence that psychology can be a science without assuming interior mental states as objects of study. John B. Watson, a leading voice, describes psychology as the study of observable behavior, stimulus, response, reinforcement, and prediction. In this framework, the interior life is either de-emphasized or reframed as a set of dispositional tendencies or theoretical constructs used to explain behavior. Behaviorism thus acts as a foil to Cartesian dualism. If the mind cannot be observed directly, perhaps it is not the proper object of scientific inquiry, or at least not in the way it was imagined by introspective psychology. The argument is not that consciousness does not exist. It is that its most scientifically legitimate study must be anchored in observable data and quantifiable relations between stimuli and responses. Yet even as behaviorism asserts a formidable methodological boundary, other strands of the century push in the opposite direction. The cognitive revolution, through the work of thinkers like Noam Chomsky in linguistics and the broader program of cognitive science, argues that mental states and processes can be studied with hypotheses about internal representations, computations, and information processing. The mind becomes a kind of software that runs on the hardware of the brain, a perspective that opens the door to functionalism, computational theories of mind, and eventually to contemporary materialist accounts of consciousness. Functionalism, in particular, argues that what matters for mental states is not their internal substance, whether material or immaterial, but their causal role, the way a given mental state responds to stimuli, produces behavior, and interacts with other mental states. A memory state, a perception of red, a desire to act, these are defined not by what they are made of, but by what they do within the system. This is a powerful move. It provides a robust framework for discussing machine intelligence and artificial systems, while staying within a materialist ontology that sees consciousness as a property or set of properties of physical systems. If we look at contemporary developments, two lines of thought stand out as especially influential for the modern imagination about mind and consciousness: Denetian functionalism and broader materialist accounts, and the more recent neurophenomenology and related approaches that attempt to fuse subjective experience with objective measurement. Daniel Dennett, in his later work, advances a form of functionalism that emphasizes multiple levels of description and the idea that what we call consciousness is the result of the brain's interpretive processes, narratively integrated by a center of narrative gravity. In Dennett's hands, consciousness is not a single window into an inner theater. It is a toolbox of abilities, a system of content that can be explained in terms of information processing, social interaction, and embodiment in the world. The famous idea, sometimes summarized in popular shorthand as "the mind is what the brain does," is meant to push us away from seeking a singular essence of consciousness and toward a more workable, scientifically tractable account that still honors the extraordinary richness of conscious life. Dennett's approach invites cross-reference to epistemology and philosophy of science by underscoring how our confidence about what we know is shaped by the experimental practices, theoretical commitments, and interpretive frameworks we adopt. It also invites us to reflect on how science constructs its own causal stories about mental life and how those stories acquire their own form of validity. Materialist accounts, more broadly, argue that consciousness arises from physical processes and can be exhaustively explained by neuroscience and physics. The mind is not a separate substance, but a set of highly organized neuronal states and transitions. This line of thought intersects with debates in philosophy of science concerning reductionism, supervenience, and the nature of explanation. Materialist accounts face a set of well-known challenges, particularly the hard problem of consciousness, a phrase widely attributed to David Chalmers and others, which asks why and how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience, feelings, and qualia. The hard problem does not merely beg for a technical solution. It raises a profound question about the intelligibility of experience, the feel, the color, the sense of what it is like to see red or to feel pain. Some philosophers respond by maintaining that the hard problem dissolves into a deeper kind of explanation, such as functional or representational accounts, or through introspective reports that reveal what it is like to be in certain mental states. Others propose a revisionist stance. Perhaps consciousness is a matter of gradual emergence, a continuum of complexity that begins with basic sensory motor loops and gradually deepens into reflective self-awareness. The debate persists because it touches the core of what it means to be alive, to be intelligent, and to be capable of thought about thought. To anchor abstract debates in something more tangible, we can attend to two famous thought experiments that crystallize core problems and force a confrontation with our intuitions. The first is the brain in a vat scenario. Imagine a brain suspended in a vat of nutrients, connected to a supercomputer that simulates all the experiences the brain would ordinarily have: the taste of chocolate, the sight of blue sky, the warmth of a hug, the sense of self. If the brain received perfectly plausible sensory inputs, how could we distinguish this situation from ordinary waking life? The thought experiment is designed to challenge naive realism and to expose the epistemic ground of our knowledge claims. If all we know is what our senses deliver to us, and if those senses can be generated by a physical process in a brain that might be isolated from any direct contact with the external world, then how secure is the claim that consciousness is even about or formed through material interactions with the world beyond us? The brain in a vat scenario does not outright refute materialism or dualism. Instead, it highlights a methodological vulnerability. A theory must be able to account for why we should trust our sensory experiences and what enables that trust beyond a simple causal chain from brain states to beliefs about the world. The second thought experiment, often paired with the brain in a vat in these debates, is the wax example we mentioned with Descartes, intensified as a general meditation on perception and essence. It is the sense that appearances are unreliable and that only the mind's rational grasp of form, the essence of extension and the nature of materiality, can reveal what a thing truly is. The wax's sensible properties change as it melts, yet our mind apprehends its essential attributes, not simply the sensory details that shift. This experiment becomes a microcosm of a larger question. To what extent do our concepts, categories, and cognitive structures determine what we think the world is like? The brain in a vat and the wax serve as twin poles. One tests the external world's verisimilitude, the other tests the mind's capacity to reach beyond appearance to an underlying reality. These are not mere tricks of thought. They are, in a sense, diagnostic tools for the epistemic health of a theory about consciousness. A further pair of mood-shaping, century-spanning developments emerge when we look at how Kant reframed the debate with his Copernican turn and what followed. Kant's claim is that the mind brings certain necessary structures to experience, shaping not only what we know but what is knowable. He contends that space and time are not properties of things in themselves, but forms through which we experience phenomena. The categories of understanding organize sensation into coherent experience. This is a decision about epistemology with immediate implications for the mind-body problem. The separation of mind and world is not a rigid ontological split, but a problem of how the mind's own structures make any experience possible. If the mind constitutes the conditions for possible experience, then the problem of consciousness gets reframed as a problem of how our conceptual machinery binds and interprets sensory input, and how to think about the boundary between what we can know and what lies beyond our cognitive reach. As we turn toward the 20th century and beyond, we encounter a set of contemporary developments with enduring influence. Dennett's programmatic naturalism, for example, does not pretend to solve the private inner life in solitary glimpses of a true nature of consciousness. Instead, it invites us to analyze mental phenomena as the products of dynamic systems that implement representations, mechanisms of control, and interpretive narratives that give rise to the sense of a unified self. The pluralistic and functional emphasis makes room for multiple realizability. The same functional state could, in principle, be realized in different physical substrates, including artificial systems. The relevant question in this light is not whether consciousness is a mysterious inner essence, but whether a system, once it exhibits the right functional properties, deserves to be described as conscious in a robust, scientifically meaningful sense. This approach has profound implications for cognitive science, artificial intelligence, and even ethics. If machines can implement the same functional architecture of mind, should they be afforded moral consideration, rights, or a certain status within our social arrangements? And if so, how would we articulate and test such claims? Beyond Dennett, materialist accounts of consciousness continue to push science toward ever more integrated explanations, neuroscience mapping, computational modeling, and theories of representation. These accounts are consistent with a broader philosophy of science that emphasizes accuracy, predictive power, and the ability to unify disparate phenomena under common causal forces. Yet the hard problem persists, as does the sense that subjective experience, the felt quality of being, is something that must be acknowledged as more than a mere byproduct of neural processing. In this sense, contemporary debates do not simply recreate the old dualist versus materialist confrontation. They reframe the issue in terms of levels of explanation, relational properties, and the normative significance of conscious states within human life and culture. The mind remains a central problem because it is where we live our most intimate questions about love, fear, longing, and meaning, and because it is where science meets philosophy in the most intimate way. Two real-world applications can illuminate the stakes of these debates. First, in education and clinical practice, an understanding of consciousness informs how we think about learning, attention, and mental health. If the mind is a stateful system whose functions can be trained, augmented, or rehabilitated through practice, we can design curricula and therapies that align with the brain's functional architecture. The wax-like plasticity of cognition mirrors a social invention. We learn to cultivate attention, regulate emotion, and shape our cognitive habits to improve resilience and well-being. Second, in the realm of artificial intelligence and human-robot interaction, functionalist and materialist views invite practical questions about machine consciousness and moral status. If a machine can reproduce the functional architecture of a mental state, perceiving, evaluating, planning, and acting, does it deserve a place in human networks of moral consideration, work, and social responsibility? The answers are not merely technical. They require a political and ethical reckoning about what counts as a person, what counts as agency, and what kind of world we want to cultivate with intelligent systems. In the course of tracing these shifts, we encounter a set of cross-references to parallel debates in epistemology and the philosophy of science that propel us toward later sections. The skeptical traditions that haunt early modern and modern philosophy, Hume's radical empiricism, for instance, with its famous bundle of perceptions, or the Enlightenment wager that science could unify knowledge under rational methods, set the stage for subsequent questions about the reliability of perception and the status of physical explanations. The philosophy of science, including recurrent concerns about theory-laden observation, the underdetermination of theory by data, and Kuhn's account of scientific revolutions, provides a mirror for our understanding of how theories of consciousness evolve. These cross-references are not mere digressions. They are essential to grasp how a theory of mind must interact with our views about knowledge, explanation, and evidence. In the broader arc of epistemology, questions about mental representation, the status of introspection, the reliability of testimony, and the nature of belief all intersect with the mind-body problem. In the philosophy of science, debates about reduction, explanation, and the boundaries of scientific inquiry help us appreciate why the mind-body question became a test case for how science and philosophy can cooperate to illuminate the inner life. Two historical anecdotes help humanize the arc and remind us that these discussions are not only abstract exercises, but human stories of intellectual courage and stubbornness. The first is Spinoza's formal rationalism. He insisted on a rigorous, deductive, almost geometric clarity in his ethics, seeking to ground the mind in a rational, almost mathematical coherence with the order of nature. This bold rationalism was not tolerated by many communities, and led to his excommunication from the Jewish community of his city and, more broadly, to a life of public intellectual isolation. Spinoza's commitment to a monistic account, in which mind and body are one expression of a single substance, is not a mere philosophical preference. It is a principled stance that resists dualistic divides and invites readers to see reason as the unifying medium of reality rather than as a force that divides mind from world for the sake of argument. His excommunication thus stands as a human testament to the tension between radical philosophical clarity and communal boundaries, a tension that he bore with remarkable equanimity. The second anecdote centers on Kant's disciplined routine, his daily walks and regimented study schedule, that helped him fashion a critical project that would shape modern philosophy for generations. Kant's habit of maintaining a strict routine was not about mere personal efficiency. It was a practical discipline that mirrored his philosophical claims about the organization of experience and the limits of human understanding. He believed that the mind's categories and forms must be held in a certain arrangement, just as his own life displayed a carefully ordered architecture. This anecdote humanizes the Copernican turn itself. It is not just a thought experiment, but a lived practice. Kant's life offers a model of how rigorous intellectual discipline can accompany and illuminate a theory that claims the mind is not a passive spectator, but a co-creator of experience. The Galileo moment, where science challenged the authority of established doctrine, also enters the tale as a reminder that moments of crisis in science can catalyze radical shifts in how we conceive the mind's place in the natural order. Galileo's insistence on evidence, his use of telescopic observation, and the consequential confrontation with conventional authority are not separate from the mind-body problem. They illustrate a broader pattern in which epistemic courage, empirical procedure, and philosophical reflection come together to revise our image of what the world is and what it requires of us as knowing beings. In sum, this foundation section has wandered through the long garden of consciousness, tracing plants from Plato's tripartite soul to Descartes' dualism, from Aristotle's teleology to Spinoza's radical monism, from Kant's structural Copernican turn to the emergent and functionalist currents of the modern era. It has asked again and again what it could mean to be a conscious agent who can think about thinking, feel what it is like to have experiences, and still move about in a world of bodies, physics, and social forms. It has insisted on two stories at once: the intimate, narrative life of minds that wrestle with questions of meaning, and the impersonal, systematic hunt for explanations that can be tested and revised. Plato's narrative of the soul and its faculties continues to matter not because it provides a final answer, but because it offers a durable framework for thinking about how inner life can be organized toward the good, how reason can govern desire, and how moral life is inseparable from the cultivation of consciousness. Descartes' narrative, for all its complications and its infamous problems about mind-body interaction, marks a crucial turn. It makes us ask whether the interior life has a clear seat within a material world, and if not, what the proper ground for that interior life might be within human experience. The subsequent decades, with their shifts toward monism, emergentism, and functionalism, remind us that the mind-body problem is not resolved simply by declaring one side right and the other wrong. It is a problem of philosophy and science that yields the richest fruit when we hold multiple perspectives in conversation, allowing them to bear on one another. As we prepare to move forward into the next sections, which will examine the 19th and 20th centuries more closely, Kant's further implications, the rise of empirical psychology, the crystallization of identity theory and behaviorism, and the development of cognitive science, we should keep two threads in view. First, the mind-body problem is not simply about a single question, but about a network of questions, about how to characterize consciousness, how to explain it, how to test explanations, and how to integrate insights from philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. Second, whatever the current consensus is, it is inseparable from the larger history of epistemology and the philosophy of science. The mind shapes what we can know and how we come to know it, and science shapes which concepts we have available to discuss consciousness. The next part of our journey will explore how these tensions played out as new frameworks, materialist, idealist, emergentist, functionalist, took shape in more recent history, and how they continue to shape contemporary debates about what it means to be conscious, how we should study consciousness, and what we owe to the person who asks, with patience and care, what it is to be human. Take a slow breath with me, let the room settle. Tonight, in this quiet corner of thought, we open a door not to the world as it is measured, but to the world as it feels. The phenomenology of experience, the texture, the color, the tremor of sensation that makes you you, right now, in this moment. We're going to walk through a landscape that philosophers have called the philosophy of human consciousness, and especially its puzzling centerpiece. The phenomenal mind, its qualia, the distinction between what is experienced and what can be accessed and reported, and the stubborn challenge of the hard problem. If you've ever wondered what consciousness feels like from the inside, you've come to the right train of thought, and will take the time to listen to the rails. To begin, what are we talking about when we speak of consciousness at all? It's not a single, simple thing like height or weight. It's a cluster of features that scientists and philosophers have tried to disentangle. Philosophers often distinguish between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness, a distinction that opens a useful doorway into the debate about what it means to be conscious. Phenomenal consciousness, or what some call P-consciousness, is the direct, felt quality of experience. The way it feels to see a red rose, to hear a B-flat, to taste something salty and sharp, to notice the warmth of the sun on your skin. It is the what it is like component of experience, as the philosopher Thomas Nagel famously put it when he asked us to imagine what it is like to be a bat. Access consciousness, by contrast, is about the contents of consciousness that are available for reasoning, reporting, deliberate control of actions, and the integration of information into the kinds of thought processes that guide our behavior and language. It's the portion of mental life that can be accessed by memory, planning, explanation, or rhetoric. To Webb's old patience, it might seem that these notions are merely tidy wordplay. But the history and the thought experiments surrounding them show that this is no accident of terminology. The ideas are not just about labeling a psychological fact. They are about what we insist consciousness must be if we want to tell a story that makes sense of private experience, public behavior and scientific explanation at once. The route we'll take is a slow one, winding through origins, major thinkers, the most famous thought experiments, and the kinds of arguments that keep philosophers awake at night. We'll also pause to note how these debates look when we bring in neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and the restless drive to understand representation, the way the mind models the world and itself. And we'll end with a sense of where the conversation stands and where it might go when new technologies press again on the old questions. Origins and the seeds of inquiry, the questions we're tracing don't begin with modern technology or with cognitive labs, though those have accelerated the conversation. They have roots as old as philosophy itself, in the human habit of asking what it means to be conscious, to feel, to know, to wonder. If we step back, we encounter a lineage that curves through many traditions. The ancient question of how the mind and the body relate, the medieval problem of how sensation is connected to thinking, the early modern struggles with the certainty of the self and the place of inner life in a world described by geometry and mechanism, and the shifting ground of the 19th and 20th centuries when introspection, the careful looking inward, began to give way to experimental methods and to calls for a science of the mind. In the modern vocabulary, a decisive shift begins in the 19th and early 20th centuries with the rise of phenomenology and the philosophy of mind's attempt to treat experience as something with a first-person character that must be taken seriously on its own terms. Among the significant voices, Edmund Husserl's Phenomenology insisted that phenomena must be studied as they present themselves to consciousness, in contrast to an abstract edifice of theories about the outside world. The line between what is observable in behavior or brain states and what is felt inside the head is not a mere methodological choice. It is a philosophical claim about the legitimacy of subjective experience as an object of inquiry. Then you have the continental tradition of Brentano with his insistence on intentionality, the mind's directedness toward objects as a hallmark of mental states. These lines of thought help to prepare the way for later discussions that would separate the felt dimension of experience from the functional capacities we can observe by looking at behavior. On a parallel track, the early 20th century also saw a crucial mathematical and empirical turn in psychology and neuroscience. The era of introspection, once the gold standard for studying mental life in the hands of the early psychologists, began to show cracks under the weight of empirical refutations and the problems of replicability. Thinkers like William James, who spoke of the stream of consciousness with a kind of lyrical humility, gave us a sense that interior life could not be reduced to a mere catalogue of mental states. Yet the scientific ambitions of the century demanded measurable claims and testable predictions. The middle of the century witnessed a more dramatic shift. Behaviorism, with its insistence that psychology should focus on observable behavior and environmental stimuli, often pushed interior experience to the periphery as subjective and inscrutable. This was not a final verdict on consciousness, but a method, a temporary rearrangement of what counted as legitimate data. Then, as the century wore on, a turn toward neuroscience and cognitive science began to reframe the dialogue. The discovery of neural correlates of consciousness, the idea that there might be brain states systematically tied to conscious experience, offered a bridge between internal life and external observation. The brain was no longer only a black box, it was a living organ with measurable activity, and the search for the neural correlates of specific experiences, seeing red, feeling pain, recognizing a friend, invited a new vocabulary of systems, circuits, and representations. The dawn of functionalism in the philosophy of mind, with its insistence that mental states could be understood in terms of their causal roles in a system, pushed the field toward a more computational analogy. The mind is something like software running on the hardware of the brain. This analogy would become central to how we think about both access consciousness and the structure of experience. In the background, we also see a shift in what counts as a legitimate problem to solve. The easy problems, as David Chalmers would later coin the phrase, are those that a science of the mind can address by studying information processing, attention, perception, and the control of behavior. These problems seem tractable because they can be broken down into components, measured, and explained with causal mechanisms. The hard problem emerges as a stubborn syndrome at the interface of subjectivity and physical explanation. Why does brain activity give rise to a felt, qualitative experience? Why does there seem to be something it is like to be a creature, a bat, a human, a beetle, and why precisely does that feel appear as it does to that subject? The hard problem asks not merely for a more detailed map of neural circuits, but for an account of why the map should feel like anything at all. From this perspective, the distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness begins to crystallize as a tool for asking sharper questions. Could it be that some cognitive processes operate without the shouldering of experience, while others are inseparably tied to what it feels like? Is there a sense in which someone can be blind to parts of the environment we would count as fully available to consciousness, yet still act with sophisticated control and reporting? The work of philosophers like Ned Block, who drew clear lines between phenomenal and access consciousness, invites us to separate two functions that often travel together in ordinary life but might not always be identical. This distinction allows for important and surprising counterexamples. It invites us to imagine cases where someone is able to respond to stimuli or report information with high accuracy, yet there remains a gap in the felt quality of experience, the sense that there is something it is like to be that person in those moments. Key thinkers in the architecture of the debate, if we ask who helped shape the modern lay of the land around qualia, the hard problem, and the distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness, the names parade in a way that shows how many intellectual currents must converge. We begin with the blunt, insurgent durability of the mind-body problem, the question of how mental states relate to physical states. René Descartes is a towering early figure for thinking in terms of radical mind-body distinction. In his Meditations, he argues that the mind is a thinking, non-extended thing distinct from the body, and that the certainty of the thinking thing, I think, therefore I am, is a starting point for knowledge that resists the full closure of mechanical explanation. The phrase cogito ergo sum marks a moment in Western thought when inward certainty became a tool for navigating a world of outward observation. The move did not resolve the mystery of consciousness, but it did insist that the inner life has its own kind of authority. Immanuel Kant adds depth to the conversation by drawing a careful boundary between the world as it appears to us, the phenomenon, and the world as it is in itself, the noumenon. The famous line about appearances and things in themselves, the thing in itself remains unknowable, provides a philosophical anchor for the sense that there may be limits to what a purely physical account can capture about inner experience. Phenomena, as Kant would say, are the objects of experience as we know them, filtered by our forms of intuition and categories of understanding. The noumenal world, by contrast, remains outside the receptive conditions of our mind in the sense in which we cannot know it directly. This is not a scientific claim about neuroscience or physics, so much as a claim about the limits of any theory that tries to close the gap between what conscious beings feel and the physical processes those beings undergo. Kant's language helps us see why some thinkers insist that there is a domain, the subjective, where the appearance of experience resists reduction to a third-person description. In the 19th century, the flowering of psychology, physiology, and increasingly rigorous experiments on perception pushed forward the attempt to tie mental life to bodily processes. But the 20th century demanded new forms of clarity about the inner life. William James spoke with a kind of pragmatic empathy about the stream of consciousness, reminding us that mindful experience is not something that can be captured by a fixed snapshot, but rather flows and shifts. The early 20th century saw the rise and then the critique of introspection as a reliable method. The behavioral revolution, with its insistence on observable behavior as the proper object of science, challenged internal states to show their explanatory power in outward actions and stimuli. The counterresponse, couched by phenomenology and then revived by cognitive science, claimed there was still a rich interior life that required its own terms of description, even if those terms could allegorically cross over into the language of computation, representation, and neural states. In this back and forth, a handful of thinkers helps us see how the 20th century both shifted the ground and clarified the questions. One crucial figure is David Chalmers, who, in his articulation of the hard problem in the 1990s, gave the debate a new topography. He argues that the hard problem, the problem of why and how physical processes give rise to subjectively felt experience, is not simply a more difficult version of the easy problems. It is of a different logical form. The easy problems are about organization and behavior, how perception works, how attention is allocated, how decision-making unfolds. The hard problem asks about something that seems to resist a purely computational or mechanistic account. Why does brain processing feel like anything at all? Why is there a subjective quality to experience, a felt life at all? The language of the hard problem invites a different kind of explanation, one that might require postulates beyond the purely physical. Against this backdrop, two other thinkers become especially consequential for the literature on qualia and consciousness, Frank Jackson and Daniel Dennett. Jackson is famous for a particular argument that has become a touchstone for debates about the nature of knowledge and the existence of phenomenal properties. In his 1982 paper, Epiphenomenal Qualia, Jackson asks us to imagine Mary, a scientist who knows everything there is to know about the science of color vision from the standpoint of physical facts within a black and white room. Mary has never seen color, yet she has learned everything there is to know about the physical and functional aspects of color processing. When Mary is released and experiences color for the first time, say, seeing red, she learns something new. She gains knowledge of what it is like to see red, which, on his argument, implies that there are non-physical facts about experience. The famous line that Mary knows all the physical facts but still learns something upon seeing color is a powerful articulation of the knowledge argument. It suggests that conscious experience includes qualitative aspects that do not follow from physical truths alone. Nagel's bat, of course, stands as a different but complementary challenge to any purely objective account. Nagel writes in his celebrated 1974 essay, "There is something it is like to be a bat." He asks us to imagine what it would be like to inhabit a bat's sensory world, to experience the world through echolocation, to have a perspective so alien to us that even a perfect ledger of neural activity would leave something crucial undisclosed. The point is not that bats are conscious in a way we cannot know, but that there is a subjective dimension to consciousness that cannot be captured by any purely objective description of the world. There is a feeling, a sense of what it is like, that names the privacy of subjectivity. If we are honest about what counts as knowledge in science, we cannot pretend that the interior life is dispensable or merely epiphenomenal. The landscape of the arguments, then, is not simply a dispute about terms. It is a dispute about what counts as a complete description of mind. It is a dispute about what kinds of facts matter and in what sense. The knowledge argument, the bat thought experiment, and the color psychology thought experiments are not merely curiosities. They function as a set of pointers to the idea that there might be a gap between the functional organization of mind, the systems and processes that allow us to act and reason, and the felt life of experience, the private, qualitative feel of seeing, hearing, desiring, fearing, and loving. The phenomena we discuss are not merely theoretical abstractions. They connect to real-world questions and to how we think about others and ourselves. The concept of qualia, the raw feel of experiences, has real consequences for debates about machine consciousness and artificial intelligence. If there were no subjective feel to color or pain, or if the felt aspect could be entirely predicted from brain states, then the popular line that a machine with the same functional organization as a human being would be conscious would take a different shape. If instead there is something irreducible about the subjective feel, then creating conscious machines becomes a more complicated project, because we would need either to reproduce or to simulate something that looks like qualitative experience, which raises further questions about the nature of that experience and its ethical and practical significance. Two central thought experiments and their meaning we can frame what follows by focusing on three crucial examples that have endured in the literature: Nagel's question about what it is like to be a bat, Jackson's Mary, and the inverted spectrum and color qualia thought experiments. Each of these is a window into essential questions about the nature of conscious life and what a complete account of mind would require. Nagel's What Is It Like to Be a Bat? It is, in its simplest form, a challenge to the notion that conscious life can be exhaustively explained from a third-person perspective alone. Even if we knew everything there is to know about the bat's neurophysiology, the claim goes, we would still lack something: the private feel, the subjective point of view of being that particular bat, and thus a complete account of what it is like to be that bat. The claim is not that we cannot study bat brains, it is that the full essence of bat consciousness includes a subjective reality that transcends a purely objective map. The sentence, "There is something it is like to be a bat," is not only a rhetorical flourish. It is a succinct way of insisting that there is a qualitative character to experience that seems resistant to complete capture by external description. The bat argument doesn't deny that bats are conscious or that we can learn a great deal about them. Nor does it claim that all of their properties can't be explained by brain processes. What it insists is that a complete scientific account of a conscious creature would seem to require an appreciation of the subjective pole of experience, the felt side that cannot be deduced from the external features of brain organization alone. The implication is a call for humility about what science can tell us about consciousness if we insist on a purely third-person vantage point. This is not a denial of scientific progress. It is a warning against the temptation to reduce the interior life to nothing but informational states. Nagel's claim invites us to ask, if we could map every neuron and every axon in the bat's brain, would we at that point understand what it is like to be a bat? The answer, Nagel suggests, might be no, and if no, then the hard problem has a stubborn core. Jackson's Mary offers a complementary line of attack by focusing on knowledge, content, and what it means to know about color. In Epiphenomenal Qualia, Jackson imagines Mary, a scientist who knows all physical facts about color vision but lives in a black and white room. She has never seen color, never been inside the subjective experience of seeing red or green. When she leaves the room and sees color for the first time, she learns something new. It is not just that she now has new information about color that would be stored in the brain. She acquires a new kind of knowledge about the qualitative feel, the felt experience itself. The knowledge argument is not simply about sensory experience. It is about whether all truths about consciousness are derivable from physical truths. If Mary learns something new upon seeing color, then there exist non-physical truths about consciousness that a purely physical account fails to capture. This is the claim that has never ceased to fuel debate. Even if we know all the physical facts, there seems to be something else, the phenomenal quality of experience, that is not already included in those facts. Color qualia and inverted spectrum thought experiments push the intuition further. They imagine two individuals whose brains are functionally identical in terms of processing color information, yet whose subjective experiences may differ as to which color corresponds to which wavelength, or who experiences a red sensation as what one person calls green and vice versa. The inverted spectrum thought experiment makes vivid how knowledge about the functional organization of perception, which wavelengths map to which colors, might not settle the inner color life of the subject. If we imagine two people with inverted color experiences but the same behavioral responses, we have to ask, can we truly know that their inner experiences match? The puzzle is not merely about language or label matching. It is about the possibility that two conscious beings can be subjectively different even if their external behavior is indistinguishable. If such a possibility is coherent, then the intimate tie between physical description and qualitative experience remains an open issue for any complete theory of mind. Over these three examples, the basic insight remains. There's a layer of experience, qualitative feel, the sense of subjectivity, that seems to resist straightforward explanation by a map of brain processes or by any purely functional account. The hard problem is not merely an extra detail to be added to the easy problems. It is a reminder that the interior life of mind appears to live in a realm that is not easily mapped onto the physical architecture of the brain. Two major counterarguments and the responses they prompt in any robust discussion of qualia, two lines of response have proved particularly influential and persistent. The first comes from a philosopher who has been among the most visible critics of the distinct status of qualia, Daniel Dennett. The second comes from a broader physicalist or naturalistic approach that tries to integrate subjective life into a full physicalist story without appealing to non-physical properties. These two lines can be distilled as a dialogue about what a complete theory of mind would look like and what role, if any, qualitative experience must play in such a theory. Dennett's critique is often summarized in the claim that qualia, as typically described, do not exist as intrinsic, ineffable properties of sensation. Instead, he argues, the feel of experience can be explained in terms of the brain's processing and the access to information by cognitive systems. In his more provocative formulations, Dennett argues that there is no Cartesian theater, a little private stage where experiences are displayed for a homunculus to observe. The idea of a central stage, where all the sensory data come together and the subject experiences them as a unified scene, he treats as a wrong-headed picture of consciousness. The brain, in Dennett's telling, creates the impression of a single narrative stream or a mental theater, but that theater, if it exists, is not something distinct from the brain's distributed systems. Qualia as private, ineffable properties that exist independently of processing would then be an illusion or a misnomer, a shorthand for a cluster of processing features, integration effects, and representational content that the brain produces and manipulates. The reply of physicalism is to insist that all aspects of experience, including the felt aspects, can ultimately be explained in terms of brain states and the causal roles those states play. The physicalist response does not deny that there is something it is like to be a conscious creature, but it argues that the qualitative character of experience is not an extra property separate from brain processes. Rather, what seems to us as qualia could be the product of a particular kind of information processing or a particular arrangement of neural architectures, which is to say that the feel of experience is not ontologically independent of the brain's physical organization. In contemporary versions, this often takes the form of sophisticated theories about representation. The brain builds internal models of the world, uses those models to guide action and perception, and the qualitative feel arises from the nature of the representational content the predictive coding loops, or the global workspaces in which information becomes globally accessible. Two other lines of response deserve note in this context. First, there is the approach that argues for multiple layers of explanation that can coexist without contradiction. You can have robust explanations of phenomenal life that are compatible with detailed physical explanations of brain states and their functions. The hard problem is not a barrier to progress in neuroscience. It is a reminder that the questions we ask about experience require a variety of modalities and a multi-layered approach to explanation. Second, there is the possibility that a new theory might reorganize our understanding of consciousness so that the apparent gulf between the subjective and the objective narrows. Some contemporary theories, like those that emphasize integrated information or the dynamics of large-scale networks in the brain, try to connect high-level functional properties to questions about subjective life, suggesting that the boundary between what it is like to be conscious and what can be measured in the brain may be more permeable than it first appears. The modern landscape, from hard problem to theories of consciousness as the decades have passed, the debate about phenomenal consciousness and access has intersected with concrete theories about how the mind works and even how machines might work. Several major theoretical frameworks have become central to contemporary discussion. Global Workspace Theory, GWT, proposed by Bernard Bars and elaborated by others, posits that conscious experience arises when information becomes globally available to various cognitive systems in the brain. In this view, the contents of consciousness are those information patterns that get broadcast to multiple highly integrated networks, enabling reporting, decision-making, and flexible control of behavior. The idea is to connect the felt experience with the functional properties of attention and information processing. It does not, in this account, deny the possible existence of subjective qualitative states. Rather, it situates consciousness in a system-level communication process that supports the idea of access consciousness. Integrated Information Theory, IIT, developed most prominently by Giulio Tononi, presents a different route. IIT attempts to quantify consciousness by the degree to which a system integrates information. The notion that consciousness corresponds to integrated information is a mathematical claim, and while IIT makes no claim about qualia per se, it is often presented as a physicalist theory that treats conscious experience as a property of the system's causal structure. IIT has become a focal point of the AI and neuroscience communities for evaluating machine consciousness, because it provides a measurable criterion that could be applied to artificial networks as well as biological ones. A different family of accounts emphasizes adversarial realism by focusing on the representational structure of perception. Philosophers like Jerry Fodor have argued for the modular and representational nature of mental life, suggesting that the mind contains a set of modules that process information semi-independently and map it onto content that can anchor belief, action, and communication. In this line, the problem of consciousness becomes partly a problem of understanding how these representations get to be integrated into coherent experiential life. But beyond these theories, the question remains. If we imagine machines with highly sophisticated cognitive architectures that closely mimic human information processing, would they be conscious in the same sense we are? The previous chapters in artificial intelligence raise questions about machine consciousness and machine experience. The classic Turing question, can machines think, extends into today's debates about the mental life of AI systems that can see, learn, reason, and perhaps even create. The debate involves not only whether a machine can demonstrate conscious behavior, but whether it can have subjective experience, the qualitative feel that seems intimately tied to being a conscious creature. Some philosophers and scientists argue that machine intelligence, no matter how advanced, may never replicate the inner life, an argument that raises ethical, epistemic, and existential questions about the nature of mind and the possibility of synthetic subjectivity. Others believe that the interior life is a matter of functional organization, and if a machine can replicate the functional properties of a conscious being, perhaps it should be understood as conscious in the relevant sense. Real-world applications and the everyday significance of these debates are not mere intellectual exercises. They have real-world implications for medicine, law, technology, and social life. Consider disorders of consciousness, where the question of what a patient experiences becomes critical to decisions about care and prognosis. In cases of sleep, anesthesia, coma, or vegetative state, the line between what the brain can do functionally and what the patient can subjectively feel matters for medical ethics, for the design of diagnostic tools, and for our understanding of personhood. The very idea of who counts as conscious and when affects how we treat beings with different neural architectures, and how we balance reasons about pain, awareness, and autonomy. In everyday life, the distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness can illuminate how we navigate attention, memory, and social interaction. When we listen to a friend, we might be fully aware of their words and the information being conveyed, and we also experience a felt sense of what the message means to us, a qualitative sense of meaning and presence. The moral and social implications of consciousness also extend to debates about animal rights, given Nagel's insistence that we must take seriously the subjective life of other beings, and to the design of AI systems that might one day participate in human communities in meaningful ways. Examples that keep the conversation anchored in lived experience. Two vivid examples, Beyond the Bat and Mary, help to illustrate how these questions arise in ordinary life and in scientific practice. First, consider pain. Pain is one of the most immediate, aversive, and private experiences we have. It is not simply a function of tissue damage or nerve signals. It has a distinctly subjective feel, a particular quality that makes the experience not just a matter of detection or reflex response, but something that colors our entire sense of self in the moment. We can imagine a scenario in which two people experience the same noxious stimulus and produce the same metabolic and neural responses, yet their experiential life might differ in certain qualitative respects. Pain, in this sense, is a vivid reminder that there may be an irreducibly personal dimension to some conscious experiences. It also forces us to confront if there could be unknown unknowns about what it is like to feel pain, especially when the pain is not accessible to verbal report in the same manner as other experiences. Second, consider what the experience of color teaches us about qualia and representation. Our everyday encounter with color is built on a complex chain of physiological and computational processes, photoreceptor activity, neural signaling, cortical processing, and perceptual integration. It is tempting to think that color experience is merely an internal mapping of wavelengths to categories like red, green, blue. Yet, the subjectivity of color life, the felt hue, persists as a data point that seems resistant to straightforward reduction. The inverted spectrum thought experiment pushes this even further, asking us to imagine two people with identical color processing physiology and behavior but with different subjective experiences of the same colors. If such a scenario is coherent, it challenges a simple, purely functional story about color perception. It pushes us to ask whether the qualitative life of color is something that could be explained away by physics, neurobiology, or information processing alone, or whether it points toward a more fundamental coherence between mind and experience. Analogies and vivid ways to think about the phenomena. One useful analogy to hold in mind is the difference between a painting and its description. The physical description, the pigment, the brush stroke, the canvas's texture, can be detailed and precise. Yet a painting also has an experience of color, a mood, a sense of presence that a schematic description cannot fully capture. The painting, in this sense, is not reducible to the textual description of the pigments and brush moves, even though the description helps us understand how the painting is made and how to appreciate it. The mind might be like that painting. The physical substrate and the computational processes give you one kind of information, while the subjective feel, how it is to see, to feel, to experience, gives you another. Another analogy is the stage and the theater. In Dennett's critiques, there is no single private stage where all experiences appear. Instead, imagine the theater distributed across many rooms in a building. The audience, the actors, the lights, the sound system, everything contributes to what the theater seems to be, even though there is no single place where all the action is shown to a single observer. The result is a picture of consciousness as a multi-layered, dynamic arrangement of processing and integration, rather than a monolithic inner theater. The user experience emerges from the interplay of many parts: attention, memory, expectation, prediction, and the control of behavior, rather than from a single, central phenomenology. A more cognitive, science-informed analogy sees consciousness as a spotlight in a large, busy workshop. The contents of the spotlight are what you can report or use in reasoning, and those contents are visible to the system's cognitive machinery across the workshop. The rest of the room may be buzzing with activity, unconscious processes, parallel streams of processing, background states that do not enter the spotlight. Access consciousness, in this sense, would correspond to which information gets into the spotlight, into the working memory, into the decisions that the system can articulate, justify, and act upon. Phenomenal consciousness would be the felt color and texture of what the spotlight reveals, the subjective experience of being in that particular moment with that particular content. Historical anecdotes that illuminate the path we've traveled. Two short vignettes may illuminate how the conversation has changed over time, and how historical shifts shape what questions we now consider central. First, the 20th century shift from introspection to neuroscience. In the early 1900s, many psychologists believed that the mind could be understood most clearly by turning the lens inward, by careful self-observation of thoughts, images, and associations. This introspective project, though rich with data about subjective experience, faced criticism for its lack of objectivity and replicability. Then came the rise of behaviorism, which shifted emphasis away from inner life toward outward behavior and stimulus-response patterns. The critique of introspection helped catalyze a broader demand for empirical methods and a more rigorously experimental approach to mental life. But the insistence on the importance of subjective experience did not disappear. Rather, it moved to the margins of mainstream psychology and wandered into the philosophical arena, where it could be treated with greater nuance and fewer demands for immediate operationalization. By mid to late 20th century, neuroscience offered a way to bring back the inner life to a place where it could be studied with neuroscientific tools, imaging technologies, and well-specified theoretical models of information processing. The result was a reframing. Consciousness could be studied in relation to the brain's architecture, networks, and dynamics, while still acknowledging the peculiarities of subjective experience. Second, the rise of cognitive science debates about representation. The 1980s and 1990s saw an intense debate about how mental states represent the world, how those representations are structured, and how they give rise to both behavior and experience. The symbolic revolution in artificial intelligence posited that the mind works much like a computer, manipulating symbols according to rules to generate intelligent behavior. Critics argued that purely symbolic accounts fail to capture how perception and sensation feel. The connectionist and neural network approaches offered an alternative that emphasized distributed representations, learning, and emergent properties. The debate over representation is not simply about better models. It is about the very nature of mental life and how the mind constructs the world. Representation is a bridge between the external world and internal experience, and it sits at the heart of questions about qualia. If the mind's representations are what we experience, then what exactly is the page on which experience is written? Are qualia simply epiphenomena that accompany representation, or do they have a kind of autonomous status? Cross-references and the wider web of debates to keep a sense of how these questions connect to broader intellectual currents. It helps to cross-reference into three domains: philosophy of mind, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. Philosophy of mind. The central issues of phenomenal consciousness, access, qualia, and the hard problem are a core bundle in the philosophy of mind. They connect to the long debates about dualism versus physicalism, about whether mental states are reducible to brain states or whether there is an irreducible mental essence. They connect to discussions about functionalism, the idea that what matters about a mental state is its causal role, not its internal constitution. They touch on the nature of intentionality, the idea that mental states are about something, whether the aboutness of the mind is dependent on subjective experience or can be fully captured by a theory of representation. And they intersect with ethical questions about humility in our claims about animal minds and future machines, especially in light of Nagel's insistence on the subjective point of view and Mary's thought experiment suggesting there is more to experience than physical facts alone. Neuroscience. In neuroscience, the search for neural correlates of consciousness aims to identify specific brain states that accompany conscious experience. The NCC project raises questions about how to define and measure conscious states, how to separate conscious content from the neural machinery that supports it, and how to interpret findings across species. It invites us to consider global dynamics, attention networks, and the role of prediction and error correction in perception. It also raises the question of whether consciousness is a gradient or a discrete phenomenon, and what kinds of neural architectures are necessary for a given conscious life. The neuroscience view does not automatically settle the questions about qualia, but it constrains what any theory of mind must be able to account for in terms of brain processes, and it gives us testable predictions about when and how consciousness ought to arise. Artificial intelligence, AI, brings a new set of pressures to bear on the problem of consciousness. If machines are to be said to think or feel or experience something, what would that require? Would a system that passes a version of the Turing test be conscious? Could it have subjective life, or would it be merely intelligent without feeling? The debates about machine consciousness connect to the qualia problem because they force us to consider the possibility that the mind's inner life, if it exists independently of our ability to tell stories about it, might be simulated convincingly enough to be indistinguishable in behavior from genuine consciousness. This in turn raises questions about the ethical and social status of intelligent machines, the rights of artificial agents, and the criteria by which we judge mind in others, including human beings and non-human animals. Quotes from primary sources and what they illuminate to anchor the conversation with strong, precise touchstones. A few primary sources and their lines are worth lifting, even as we navigate a broader landscape of interpretation. First, Nagel's crisp invitation to humility about our perspective. There is something it is like to be a bat. This line is often quoted as a hammer of the idea that subjective experience is inherently inaccessible to a purely external standpoint. The claim is not about bats alone. It is a challenge to any science that would claim to exhaust consciousness by mapping brain states alone. When Nagel writes, there is something it is like to be a bat, the punch is not just about bats. It is a general call to recognize the interior life's precedence for consideration in any robust theory of mind. Second, Jackson's Mary and the knowledge argument. The central claim that Mary knows all the physical facts and yet learns something upon experiencing redness is a powerful claim about the limits of physicalism. The Mary thought experiment has become a fixture in the landscape of debates about whether there are non-physical truths that science cannot capture. It is not a wholesale attack on physicalism. It is a robust challenge to the claim that all truths about mind must be physical truths. It invites us to consider whether phenomenal properties are real properties or whether they are best explained as convenient but ultimately reducible to other aspects of physical description. Third, Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena, and the line about thoughts without content and intuitions without concepts. Kant offers a stern caution that what we know is mediated by the forms of our own minds, and that the outer world will not yield its deepest secrets by simple measurement alone. In a modern mirror, this can be read as a reminder that first-person experience is a kind of data that must be interpreted with appropriate conceptual tools, and that scientific theories may require a new grammar to capture the interior life. Fourth, the Cartesian theater idea that Dennett challenges. The phrase captures a common intuition, that there is a private stage inside the brain where everything comes together for a viewer. Dennett's critique is that this intuition is a misreading of how conscious life actually works, and that the theater, if it exists, would be a redundant fiction. He pushes us to think about consciousness in terms of distributed processing and global accessibility rather than a single stage in which a spectator sits. One more thought to hold at the center. The hard problem calls for a kind of explanation that is different in kind from the explanations of the easy problems. The easy problems can be solved with standard scientific methods by mapping out networks, circuits, and computational roles. The hard problem asks why these processes are accompanied by the felt experience of being in the world, the vivid life of awareness that makes the mind intimate to itself. It is not necessarily a claim that such experiences cannot be explained. It is a claim that the explanation will look different, more like a union of empirical discoveries and a conceptual shift that acknowledges the positive reality of subjective life and its possible independence from simplistic physical reduction. A note on cross-referencing and a map for further study. If you hear these sections in a video or listen to a talk, you can expect a web of cross-references to other big discourses in philosophy of mind, neuroscience, and AI. Here are a few anchors you can use to trace connective tissue. Philosophy of mind. The debate about qualia is deeply connected to discussions about the nature of mental states, intentionality, and the status of the mind as a causal and representational system. It intersects with debates about functionalism, property dualism, epiphenomenalism, panpsychism, and the possibility that there are multiple ways to account for the interior being within a broader physical world. Neuroscience. The search for neural correlates of consciousness, studies of attentional networks, and the exploration of how patterns of neural activity give rise to perception and awareness inform our understanding of how subjective experience might be tied to physical states. The emergence of theories like GWT and IIT demonstrates how neuroscience and philosophy can collaborate in productive ways, even as they disagree on whether qualia exist as independent properties or are emergent from information processing. Artificial intelligence, a central question in AI ethics and theory, is whether or not machines can have subjective experience and what it would be like to be a machine. The question of machine consciousness does not purely hinge on the ability to simulate behavior, but also on whether the mind's inner life could arise within a system built from silicon and code. Philosophers and computer scientists debate whether a machine can be conscious in the sense humans are. Some take the stance that functional equivalence matters, while others insist that subjective experience is a requirement that cannot be faked. History of science, the shift from introspection to neuroscience and cognitive science, is not just a change in tools, but a shift in the language we use to describe mind. The anecdote of the 20th century's quiet revolution in how we study the mind, moving away from private introspection toward public reproducible measures, helps to frame why this debate remains so difficult. The subject of consciousness resists simple empirical capture even as it remains central to human life. A few thoughts on interpretation and evolving views as we move toward the end of this segment. It seems fitting to acknowledge that the scene is unsettled in a hopeful way. Unsettled does not mean ignorant or uncertain in a negative sense. It means the field is alive with questions, and the questions themselves have a way of driving progress. There are modern interpretations that fuse the best intuitions of counterarguments with the ambition to understand. The cognitive science vantage points remind us that conscious experience might be accessible, at least in principle, through a full account of brain activity and its integration with system-wide processes. The phenomenology-laden vantage points remind us that subjectivity carries its own weight, its own claims to be considered in a theory of mind that attempts to be true to what it feels like to be alive. Consider two modern possibilities that reflect the broader mood. First, some scholars argue that the hard problem might not be a problem of missing facts, but a problem of misframing. If we reframe the question to focus on the relationship between conscious access, narrative, and the ability to reflect and report, we might find that the most intractable features of experience are best understood as a kind of function of cognitive architecture rather than a separate property. In this line, the hard problem dissolves into a cluster of tasks we can gradually solve by improving our models of perception, attention, memory, and decision-making, while the interior life simply emerges as a byproduct of these processes. This is not a claim that there is no interior life, rather, it is a claim about the conceptual scaffolding we use to explain it. Second, others argue in the direction of new physics for consciousness, whether through the lens of information theory, quantum models, or novel interpretations of physicalism. These voices are not universal in their predictions, but they illustrate the breadth of thought about what an eventual integration of the interior life with a physical theory would require. The crucial thing to observe is that the ground is not fixed. The language of experience, the structure of evidence, and the conceptual frameworks are all in play. The field is a living conversation that keeps inviting fresh perspectives, new experiments, and more precise formulations. Closing reflections and a gentle invitation as we close this segment, I invite you to consider not just the answers that science or philosophy might offer, but the questions they prompt in you. When you think about what it is like to be you, this very moment, notice where your attention goes. Do you feel a particular color in your perception, a texture to your thoughts, a sense of self that seems to endure as you listen? Do you find yourself asking whether those experiences are simply the byproducts of physical processes, or whether there is something more there, something that resists capture in a map of neural activity or a series of sensory reports? If you're inclined toward a more skeptical view about qualia, you're in good company with the tradition that asks for caution in how we interpret subjective life. If you're drawn to the view that subjective life is a real feature that science must address in its own terms, you join a robust line of inquiry that sees mind and brain as a single, evolving system in which experience is neither incidental nor reducible to nothing more than a set of mechanical processes. If you're somewhere in the middle, you might see value in a more plural approach. Treat phenomenal aspects as real, but look for them in the patterns of brain activity, in the structure of representations, in the way information flows through large-scale networks, in the way we experience and report what we know, and in the moral and epistemic implications of those experiences. In the hours and days to come, in your reading and your listening and your experiments with thought, you may find that the questions become more precise rather than simpler. You may discover that there is a kind of beauty in the stubbornness of the mind's interior life. A life that resists reduction to mere mechanism, yet invites us to learn how the brain can sustain such life in a universe that behaves in regular, law-governed ways. The field of consciousness studies invites us to be patient with ambiguity, to listen to the textures of experience, and to stay curious about the relationship between what can be measured, what can be described, and what is felt. So we close this segment with a sense of stillness and ongoing inquiry. The phenomenal mind, with its qualia and its capacities for access, sits at the intersection of how we feel and how we think, how we coordinate with others, how we interpret the world, and how we imagine the possibility of minds beyond human life. The questions are hard, and perhaps they will stay hard in some form for a long time. Yet to approach them with a calm, reflective curiosity, very much in the spirit of Snooze philosophy, is not to surrender to mystery, but to remain open to the sense that every answer carries with it a new horizon of questions. The mind remains a vast and intricate territory, and we are, in a modest way, travelers who keep returning to the same questions because they matter to how we live, how we relate to others, and how we understand the person we see in the mirror. If you'd like to take this journey deeper, we can continue with further excursions into demographic variations in the phenomenology of experience, the role of expectation and belief in shaping perceptual life, and more case studies that illuminate how science and philosophy speak to one another. We could also explore how different cultural traditions have thought about the interior life, how phenomenology has been integrated into contemporary cognitive science, and how advances in neurotechnology might redefine what we mean by the felt life of consciousness. The conversation about the phenomenal mind is not a finished map. It is a living, evolving dialogue in which each voice adds another layer to our shared understanding. And if you listen closely, you may hear the quiet wisdom tucked within the questions themselves. That there is something it is like to be you, that your experience is meaningful, and that the search to understand it is a thoughtful, intimate, and genuinely human pursuit. The self is not a single, unchanging entity so much as a moving story we tell about ourselves. It feels immediate, intimate, the one thing in experience that seems to endure through time, even as our bodies age, our memories blur, our desires shift, and the world around us changes in ways we scarcely recognize. In this segment, we're going to explore self, identity, and the narrative self as a living problem in philosophy, a problem that sits at the crossroads of memory, mind, ethics, and culture. We'll trace origins, weigh major theories, listen to the strongest arguments for and against each, and consider the real-world consequences of how we think about who we are. We'll dive into vivid examples, hear from some of the most influential thinkers, and we'll invite you to think with us about whether a person is a single core essence, or a branch and braid of memories, intentions, and social narratives. Take a slow breath, consider the last decade of your life, those days, those decisions, those conversations that you feel still shape who you are today. What would it mean for your sense of self if those memories were somehow altered, lost, or rearranged? What would remain, and what would be required for moral responsibility, for love, for a future you might call your own? Origins of the problem and the shape of the field emerge out of a long philosophical history that keeps circling back to the same essential question. What is the basic unit that we should call the self? Is it a soul, a single continuous thread of inner identity, a web of relations and memories, or a community of dispositions that only loosely hang together? To see why the question matters, notice how often everyday life assumes some stable center. People seek recognizable continuity in law and penalty, in memory sharing with loved ones, in the sense that a person who has committed a crime should be held accountable in a way that respects the person who existed earlier, not an unrecognizable stranger. The problem is not simply semantic, it touches the core of ethics, memory, and cognitive science. If the self is a fiction, a narrative we tell to give order to chaos, what follows for responsibility, punishment, forgiveness, and repair? If the self is a bundle of perceptions, as the philosopher David Hume famously suggested, then what guarantees that any particular stream of experiences constitutes a person across time? And if the self is a no-self, as many Eastern traditions contend, what does moral life look like when there is no fixed center to anchor intention or memory? Let's begin at the origin points that have shaped modern debates. In the English-speaking philosophical tradition, the trigger is often traced to John Locke, who insisted that personal identity over time depends crucially on memory. The very idea that what makes me the same person across a span of years is the continuity of memory, my remembering something I did yesterday, or the memory of a promise I made last year, was a radical departure from a view that identity might rest on the soul, the form, or some unchanging inner essence. Locke's proposal reframed survival not as a metaphysical primitive, but as a practical, epistemic continuity. If I can remember an action as mine, then I am the same person who did that action. If I cannot remember it, then perhaps I am not the same person who did it. The implications are enormous. If memory fails, if memory is unreliable, or if a brain event prevents one from recalling a past life, then the identity of the self could be jeopardized or reconfigured in ways that would have once seemed impossible. We meet a stark contrast in Hume, who argues for a radical decentering of the self. He provocatively claims that the self is not a thing at all, but a bundle or collection of perceptions that constantly succeed each other. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, he writes, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of which I am still conscious. The self, then, is a nexus of experiences, a moving seam rather than a fixed strand. The famous corollary is that there is no simple, persisting I that bears the same name through time. Rather, there is a continuity of sense impressions, causal links, and mental states that people tend to interpret as unity. Hume's view dissolves the self as an innermost essence, replacing it with a phenomenology of flux. This is not merely a skepticism about identity, it is a challenge to the moral psychology that depends on stable selfhood. If there is no fixed self to own a memory, if the self is a narrative emergent from the connections among perceptions, then what grounds moral responsibility, life projects, or personal growth? We should not overlook the longer spiritual and philosophical traditions that offer an opposite intuition, the self as a stable center amid change. In many Western and Eastern frameworks alike, there is a tension between a deep-seated sense of a core I and the recognition that life's changing conditions constantly pull that sense in new directions. Buddhism, for example, advances a robust critique of a fixed, unchanging self through the doctrine of anatta, or not self. The claim is not merely that the self is illusory in a trivial sense, but that the default expectation of a persisting, singular ego is a cognitive misinterpretation of the way phenomena arise and pass away. In Pali, the axiom sab sankara anatta, all conditioned phenomena are not self, expresses a radical, practical stance. The things we tend to call me or mine are not in a fixed essence but a contingent cluster of processes and dispositions that come and go. This is not simply a metaphysical claim, it has ethical consequences. If there is no fixed self, how should we conceive responsibility, desire, and change? If I am a process rather than a substance, how do I relate to others and to the future? Let me pull in one of the most influential modern articulations of these ideas, the memory-based account, the psychological continuity account, and the bundle theory, along with the no-self tradition. Each of these frameworks attempts to articulate what it takes for a person to survive through time, what it means for the same person to be the one who grows, learns, errs, and makes choices across years. They are not simply abstractions. They guide decisions in law, medicine, and social policy. They shape how we understand addiction, aging, and the possibility of moral reform. They inform debates in cognitive science about how memory, emotions, and identity are coordinated within the brain. They also illuminate the fiction of a single, continuous I who is the author of every action, a fiction that can be either liberating or constraining, depending on how one reads it. Let us begin with a core figure, John Locke. Locke's program is to ground personal identity in the continuity of consciousness, especially memory. He argued, in effect, that the same person is the one who can remember their past thoughts and actions. If I can remember performing a particular action in the past, then I am that agent across time. If I cannot remember it, then I am not necessarily the same person who performed it. The practical upshot is that memory acts as a bridge across time, and the bridge is what binds past and present selves. Here is a simplified paraphrase of the core idea. Personal identity over time is the memory linkage that preserves the sense of a continued self, even as the physical body changes. This is not a mere introspective hunch. For Locke, memory is a cognitive, narrativizable mechanism. The memory chain acts like a chain of evidence that supports the claim, I am the same person who did that and who will do that again, provided I can access the relevant memories. To illuminate Locke, consider the famous memory thought experiments that philosophers love to imagine. Suppose a person has a memory of committing a certain act in childhood. If this person later undergoes a brain transplant or a radical transformation of disposition, and yet retains that memory and can articulate it, Locke would say the same person persists by virtue of memory continuity. If, however, the memory fails or is replaced by false memories, then the identity could be called into question. This does not mean that the body is irrelevant. The body remains the vehicle that houses and transmits experience, and social, legal, and ethical judgments often fixate on that continuity too. Yet for Locke, memory is the hinge on which the door of personal identity swings. A telling anecdote from the historical context helps illuminate Locke's temperament and the way his memory criterion was received. The late 17th and early 18th centuries were a time of scientific upheaval, where memory, reason, and identity were not abstract abstractions, but practical questions about responsibility, education, and criminal law. Locke's own life, with its curious debates over the nature of knowledge, its emphasis on experience, and his political writings, reveals a mind trying to reconcile a social order with the fragility of memory and the fallibility of human recollection. The appeal of the memory criterion lay not only in its elegance but in its pragmatic alignment with legal and moral life. If memory ties a person to past deeds, then punishment and praise can be directed toward the same agent across time. This is why Locke's memory-based approach resonated across centuries, even as it provoked powerful objections. Among the principal objections, the most famous is the worry that memory can be unreliable, fragmentary, or even manipulated by others, memory disorders, aging, or false confabulation. If memory is the sole anchor of identity, then what happens when memory breaks down? In the real world, memory failures are not rare. Amnesia, dementia, brain injury, and neurodivergent differences can all disrupt the coherent chain of memory. If the chain is broken, does that mean identity is broken too? Locke was aware that memory is not a perfect ledger. He would respond that memory is the best, most practical criterion available, but he would also concede that moral responsibility might require looking beyond memory alone, perhaps to a broader psychological continuity or to the social recognition of a person's ongoing discourse. The tension here becomes a guiding thread for later thinkers who would either sharpen or rework Locke's insight. From Locke we move to David Hume, whose radical analysis of the self challenges memory's centrality by shifting the focus from a single, persistent entity to a dynamic collection of perceptions. Hume's famous claim, often encapsulated in the phrase that the self is a bundle or collection of different perceptions, rather than a fixed substance, invites a radical reframe. The story we tell about a self is the story of how those perceptions are connected and organized into a coherent narrative. The heart of Hume's argument is skepticism about essentialism. There is no underlying I that remains constant through the flux of experience. Instead, what endures is a mental habit of linking experiences into a sense of self. The sentence often quoted in philosophy syllabi is direct and luminous. The mind is a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other and are in a perpetual flux and movement. When we hear those words, we hear a challenge to the deep intuition that there is a stable I beneath our thoughts, a challenge that has echoed through time into contemporary debates about narrative identity and moral responsibility. Hume's own intellectual history makes his intervention especially fitting for this discussion. He was writing in a time of religious wars, scientific revolution, and a new sense that the mind itself could be treated as an object of study. He writes in the treatise that he can never observe the self directly, only the succession of perceptions, sensations, memories, desires, passions that appear to consciousness. This position does not simply deny the existence of a self. It relocates the center of gravity. We become aware of a stream of internal events that we interpret as a person. The psychological life of the subject, its hopes, fears, plans, and regrets, becomes a constellation that we label the self, even as that constellation has no fixed core. And here we see a crucial methodological move, to explain identity not as a metaphysical substance, but as an organizational principle of experiences. Hume's bundle theory invites us to attend to the social and ethical consequences of decentering the self. If I am a bundle, then the question, what is the essential self that should be morally praised or blamed, may be the wrong question. The ethical problem becomes one of predicting the future trajectory of a bundle of perceptions and dispositions, of maintaining or altering the connections among these perceptions in order to achieve desirable outcomes. This reframes questions of blame, punishment, and reward, previously anchored in a supposed inner, enduring essence, into issues about the continuity and coherence of the person's current and future states. The no-self tradition that enters later into the discussion intensifies this move. If there is no self to speak of in the sense of an everlasting me, then perhaps our normative architecture must be reoriented toward the social and phenomenological life we share. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen a deepening of the no-self tradition in Eastern philosophies, as well as a renewal of interest in Western phenomenology and cognitive science. The idea is not simply that the self is an illusion, but that the sense of a fixed center may be a byproduct of cognitive processes, attention, memory, narrative construction, and intersubjective negotiation. The no-self reading invites a practical discipline. It asks us to examine how much of our sense of self is constructed by the stories we tell, the social roles we perform, and the contexts in which we live. It also invites a critical question. If there is no fixed self, what does it mean to be responsible for one's actions? Can accountability be preserved in a framework where the self is continuously reconstituted across moments? Let us examine a set of core theories that have dominated the debate, and then present two sets of crucial counterarguments to test their robustness against objections from elsewhere in philosophy, cognitive science, and lived experience. First, memory continuity theory, the idea that personal identity over time is grounded in memory, specifically, the ability to remember past experiences, intentions, and actions as one's own. Memory continuity is the bridge that preserves self across time, even as the body changes. This theory captures a strikingly intuitive intuition. I am the same person who did those things because I can recall them. Yet this approach invites obvious challenges. What about false memories, memory distortions, or memories that are implanted? If someone is the same person but claims false memories or is confused about past episodes, does identity still ride on memory? How far can memory extend before it loses its grip on identity? Second, the purely psychological continuity account, advanced prominently by Derek Parfit, broadens the criterion from memory to a continuous chain of psychological connections, including beliefs, desires, intentions, and character traits. Parfit is clear that identity in the strict sense, numerical identity of a person, may be less important than continuity of psychological life. He writes that what matters for survival is not that you remain identical, but that your life and your mental life continue in a connected way into the future. The moral implications are provocative. If we can maintain continuity of your mental life even if numerical identity fails, for instance, due to duplication or other radical transformations, then moral concern might ride more on preservation of personhood in a structural sense, on keeping the same patterns of thought, memory, and intention, than on an unbroken metaphysical thread. Third, bundle theories, most famously associated with Hume, suggest that the self is a collection or bundle of perceptions held together by memory, causality, and habit. Identity is not a deep, independent thing but a practical construction, a narrative glue that organizes experiences into a coherent self. The strengths of this view lie in its sensitivity to the fluidity of experience and its humility about claims of central essence. Its challenge is that we still routinely talk and act as though there is a person to be held morally and legally responsible, a person who must be recognized by others. If the self is a bundle, then responsibility might need to be framed in terms of behavioral predictability, social trust, and the possibility of reform rather than a single unalterable inner core. Fourth, no-self traditions, especially in Buddhist and some other Eastern philosophies, offer a contrasting analysis. The sense of a fixed self is a cognitive illusion, a product of ordinary language and mental habits rather than a feature of reality. The practice and philosophy aim to loosen attachment to a permanent ego so that one's actions arise more directly from compassion and awareness rather than from a self-centered impulse. The ethical aim is not to annihilate agency but to transform it, so that actions originate in present awareness and interdependent conditions rather than a stubborn sense of I as the origin of motivation. The no-self position has significant qualitative implications for moral responsibility. If no fixed self exists, who bears responsibility for actions? The response typically involves pointing to the social, relational, and causal networks in which actions emerge, so that accountability remains meaningful without presupposing a transcendent, unchanging center of personality. In the middle of these theoretical landscapes, two lines of evidence and argument stand out as especially fertile for understanding whether identity is a stable core or a dynamic narrative. The first is the ship of Theseus scenario, a thought experiment that has traveled through centuries but is particularly apt for illustrating the problem of identity over time. Imagine a ship that, over a long voyage, gradually has every single part replaced with a new one. After a century, not a single original plank remains. Is it still the same ship? If yes, what would count as the identity criteria? If no, at what point did the identity break? The ship of Theseus is not asking only about objects. It's asking about the criteria by which we determine whether change in matter, whether wood strain or memory content, leads to a different identity. When this story is transposed to a person, the question becomes, if my brain is replaced piece by synthetic or altered cells, if my memories mutate, if my personality is redistributed by medication or neurodivergent differences, am I still the same person? Second, we must attend to real-world disruptions to self-continuity, memory failures, aging, amnesia, and neurodivergence. Memory failures threaten the anchor points of I remember this instance that Locke cherished. Aging can erode the granularity and reliability of autobiographical memory, while neurodivergence might reorder the axis by which we experience time, selfhood, and intention. Consider aging and dementia. As memories fade, the continuity of the self fractures, and yet people often retain a coherent sense of identity in practical life and social roles. This resilience of lived identity, even amid memory loss, becomes an important test for any theory. If the self is merely a bundle of perceptions, what happens when some of those perceptions fail to align or vanish? Does funerary memory create a new type of continuity, perhaps through associations with loved ones, social roles, or embodied rituals? The implications stretch into social policy and medical ethics. When do we treat someone as the same person who deserves autonomy and dignity? And when do we shift toward a care-centered, relational understanding that recognizes identity as something that can evolve rather than something fixed? A third crucial real-world domain concerns brain disconnection cases, such as split-brain patients who have undergone hemispheric separation. In some cases, each hemisphere seems to command separate streams of thought and even different intentions. In these cases, the unity of the self appears to be more fragile than everyday experience might suggest. The split-brain literature, beginning in the mid to late 20th century with studies by Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, provides dramatic demonstrations that cognition can be divided, that there can be multiple centers of deliberation in one body, and that the self might be a negotiated synthesis among several modules of the brain rather than a monolithic, unitary entity. These cases push us to ask, what would identity be in a world where there are two centers of will, two sets of memories, two sets of preferences that cannot always be harmonized? Do we encounter a more comprehensive or more troubling sense of what it means to be a person, and how does that affect moral responsibility and social recognition? Let us now engage two robust counterarguments to pure forms of these accounts. First, the Parfitian reductionist argument about what matters in survival and morality challenges the primacy of identity itself. Parfit's central claim is not that identity is irrelevant. Rather, what matters is the continuity of the person's psychological life, memory, preferences, character, and the ability to form intentions that endure and influence future actions. If two branches of the same person could continue to exist in a way that preserves these psychological connections, the moral weight of harm, benefit, and reward might be sustained even in cases where a strict numerical identity would be questionable. In other words, Parfit urges a focus on what makes life meaningful and coherent, rather than on whether a perfect, unbroken identity persists. The implication for ethics is significant. Moral responsibility is linked to the continuity of mental life rather than to an ontological commitment to a single, numerically identical substance. If two hypothetical duplicates or dramatic transformations preserve the continuity of psychological properties, the moral landscape remains navigable. A second, equally potent counterargument comes from phenomenology and the no-self tradition, which critique the idea that there is a stable, inner essence that can ground identity. Phenomenologists like Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasize lived experience, embodiment, and intersubjectivity. They argue that identity is not the discovery of an inner kernel, but the ongoing process of being in the world with projection, perception, and intersubjective negotiation. From this vantage, the self is less a thing than a practice, a way of organizing experience around a center that emerges from embodied action, social engagement, and interpretive schemes. The no-self tradition asserts something even more radical. The sense of a fixed inner I arises from linguistic and perceptual habit rather than from any independent metaphysical feature. If the self is a story we tell ourselves and others, then it is open to revision, reauthoring, and even deconstruction. The ethical upshot is that responsibility might be reframed in terms of relational accountability, intersubjective trust, and the ability to respond to others in present moments rather than ascribed to some timeless inner agent. In a moment of historical reflection, consider two vivid anecdotes that illuminate the debate. The first concerns Locke's theory of memory as the basis of the self. Locke's argument arose in a climate of new experiments with thought and experience, an era that valued empirical grounding and the reliability of memory as a guide to practical judgment. The memory criterion is not just a speculative claim, it maps onto everyday social life. When you claim a memory as yours, you stake a claim on a past action as belonging to you. It aligns with legal practices that hold individuals responsible for acts they remember or recall, and it resonates with the therapeutic goal of helping people repair broken autobiographical narratives or reconstruct a coherent sense of self after trauma. Locke's idea would strongly emphasize the narrative's continuity. A person who cannot remember their past may still act in ways that demonstrate continuing intention, but the explicit link to memory marks continuity as essential to personal identity. The second anecdote concerns Hume's radical decentering of the self. Hume's meditation on the self as a bundle of perceptions is not a dry metaphysical claim, but a mirror for how we experience life. A procession of impressions, sensations, and ideas, constantly reconfiguring themselves as we live. If the self is a bundle, then the moral weight we assign to a person's actions must be understood as situated within a broader ecology of experience, causal connections, social relationships, and predictability of behavior. The aim is not to erase responsibility, but to reframe it in a way that is faithful to how human beings actually think, feel, and decide. This move has informed contemporary discussions about memory, narrative identity, and moral responsibility. If memory is imperfect, and if identity is not a fixed essence, then responsibility must be construed as a problem of keeping a person's life story coherent enough to sustain meaningful accountability, while recognizing the fragility and plasticity of autobiographical memory. To bring the discussion into the present, let us turn to the modern terrain of narrative identity. Paul Ricoeur, a central figure in this line of thought, offers a bridge between the practical and the philosophical. He argues that we are stories we tell about ourselves, or more formally, that identity emerges through the self-narration that gives coherence to life's episodes. Narrative identity integrates memory, intention, and interpretation to produce a recognizable person who can anticipate, plan, and justify actions. In Ricoeur's influential frame, we are not simply memory-bearing beings. We are authors who continually revise the plot of our lives. The ethical import is clear. Moral action is not a simple execution of pre-existing rules, but a creative act that fits within an ongoing narrative. The same holds for social practice. The law and medicine, education and therapy all rely on a narrative sense of self to grant agency, to structure accountability, and to guide reform. Another way to frame contemporary debates is to see the tension between two large currents: the cognitive science of continuity and the phenomenology of lived experience. Studies in memory research show that autobiographical memory, the patient memories that anchor identity, are highly reconstructive rather than perfectly accurate. The hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and the networks that link memory with emotion and future planning all participate in a dynamic process of memory consolidation and retrieval. Neurodivergent conditions can reorder how memory flows, how one perceives time, and how the self constructs a coherent life story. This cognitive science of continuity aligns with a broader ethical claim. Continuity is a practical achievement, not a metaphysical given. It depends on the reliability of memory, the courage to tell and retell one's story, and the social scaffolding that helps sustain a person's sense of self through the storms of illness, aging, and difference. At this point, let us pivot toward two real-world applications and two modern interpretations that foreground the practical stakes of identity theories. First, in ethics and law, the narrative identity approach has significant consequences for moral responsibility and criminal justice. If what matters for responsibility is the continuity of a person's life story and the alignment of past intentions with future actions, then the question of whether a person is the same across a change in memory or a drastic transformation becomes a policy question. How to balance compassion with accountability, how to assess a person's ability to form intentions and to control behavior, and how to respond to cases of severe neurological impairment. The no-self critique further implies the necessity of relational accountability. Responsibility can be understood as a network of duties and expectations among families, communities, and institutions, rather than the prerogative of a solitary inner agent. Law's insistence on consistent subjectivity is softened by the recognition that identity is fluid, and that social recognition, preserving dignity, allowing for rehabilitation, enabling meaningful life projects, often comes before the retrieval of an authentic core self. Second, within memory research and cognitive science, the narrative self provides a fruitful framework for interpreting data about memory formation, autobiographical memory, and temporal orientation. Autobiographical memory is not a simple archive but an interpretive construct shaped by emotion, social feedback, and narrative needs. The continuity of self, its sense of being a subject across time, depends on how these memories are integrated into stories that the person can live with, tell, and revise. The scientific study of memory shows not only that memory is fallible, but that it can be strategically reinforced or reorganized by therapy, education, or life storytelling. This has practical implications. How we support aging individuals, neurodivergent people, or those who have experienced trauma, how we design therapeutic interventions that strengthen adaptive narratives, and how we understand the moral psychology of everyday life. If memory is the anchor, therapy and social support become a form of memory engineering, helping a person recover a narrative that enables flourishing rather than despair. A modern interpretation that deserves special attention is the narrative identity model, which integrates philosophical insights with empirical research about memory, brain function, and social context. In this picture, identity is not something derived from a single inner guarantee, but a project, an ongoing attempt to weave together intention, memory, and social recognition into a coherent story. The narrative approach aligns with the human experience of growth and change. We revise our stories as we learn, as our values shift, and as we respond to others. It explains why people who suffer memory loss can still act with moral regard, or why someone without perfect memory can still perceive themselves as the same person in a meaningful sense. It also clarifies the ethical weight of memory authenticity, social relationships, and the integrity of self-understanding. The narrative self is not a denial of a core self. It is an expansion of what counts as the self. An ongoing, aspirational, and socially embedded project. Let us complement this with a few concrete analogies that help illuminate the intuition behind these theories. Think of the self as the author of a living novel. The ship of Theseus serves as a parable within this metaphor. If the author replaces chapters and sentences over time, is the story still the same narrative arc? It's not simply a matter of whether the plot is identical. It's a question of whether the protagonist's core concerns, the arcs of memory, and the central moral commitments persist in a way that makes sense of the whole story. Another helpful image is that of a concert, where the same symphony can be performed by different instruments across time. The melody, the song's contour, remains recognizable, yet the exact sounds we hear can shift due to instruments, players, and acoustics. Identity would then be a matter of continuity of the musical line, not a guarantee that every note remains unchanged. A third analogy is that of a library or archive. A life is a library of memories, tales, and chapters, where the order, emphasis, and interpretation of the entries shape the sense of a coherent identity. We rearrange the shelves, add new volumes, translate memories into new languages, but the library remains a single, living organism of meaning. In each analogy, the question remains: what counts as the same story across time, when the medium for telling that story, memory, language, embodiment, may itself be reshaped? We should not neglect a set of historical anecdotes that illuminate how these ideas emerged, shifted, and collided. Locke's memory-based theory did not arise in a vacuum. It was part of a broader English philosophical project that tried to connect knowledge, self, and social order with experience and testimony. The early modern period was a time of great social experimentation, treaties, revolutions, and reorganizations of property and authority. Memory became not only a cognitive faculty, but a social instrument. The court of memory, as it were, that validates who is responsible for what they did and who must answer for their actions. The memory criterion, in its appeal to personal continuity through memory, found a receptive audience among jurists and political theorists who sought a coherent way to assign responsibility across a changing social fabric. The anecdote of the era's debates over religious confession, property, and identity helps us see why Locke's approach was so compelling and why its limitations prompted a wider search for deeper accounts of psychological continuity. Hume's radical bundle theory arrived as part of an even larger movement to show that much of what we take as metaphysical certainty is an effect of habit, language, and mental organization. He was pushing back against the possibility of a robust inner self that remains the same through all fluctuations. In doing so, he offered a cognitive model of subjectivity that resonates with contemporary discussions about how the brain constructs a sense of agency and ownership. This radical decentering invites humility about the claims we make about our inner lives. It also invites us to look more carefully at the social basis of identity, how others recognize us, how we are addressed, and how those interactions themselves shape the continuity we experience. The anecdotal clue here is that the self is a social product as much as an individual phenomenon. The people and communities that keep us in the social loop also stabilize our sense of identity through shared narratives, recognized roles, and the expectations we learn to meet. Let us now cross into the territory of modern debates about narrative identity and moral responsibility. The normative questions arise with particular sharpness in clinical settings, in the adjudication of criminal cases involving neurodivergence or memory impairment, and in personal life choices about change, growth, and rehabilitation. Narrative identity emphasizes that the stories we tell about ourselves matter, and that those stories guide behavior, shape long-term goals, and influence how others interpret our actions. If a person's narrative falls apart because memory deteriorates or because a transformative life event disrupts the old plot, the question becomes not whether the person continues to exist in a metaphysical sense, but how to preserve the meaningful, life-sustaining arc of selfhood. The ethical corollary is not to insist on a hollow, unchanging essence, but to attend to the practical work of ensuring that a person can continue to live with purpose, dignity, and responsibility. Let us circle back to Parfit for a moment. Parfit challenges the gravity of personal identity by arguing that what matters morally is not strictly the numerical identity of a person through time, but the continuity of psychological states and relationships. If continuity of thought, memory, preferences, and intentions persists across life, then moral responsibility can be maintained even in cases where the strict identity is in question. This is not a license for lax accountability. It is a redefinition of what counts as the ongoing self that ought to be guided and reshaped by moral considerations. When Parfit writes that identity is not what matters, he does not deny the felt experience of self, but asks us to reorient our expectations. We do not need a metaphysical central self to deserve responsibility. We need a robust and coherent life story structure that can be ethically engaged, corrected, and repaired. The implication for practice is clear. Communities and legal systems should design accountability mechanisms that recognize continuity of mental life and social relations, rather than fixating on the stubborn question of whether a person remains the exact same across time. Yet the phenomenological and no-self critiques remind us that there is a persistent, challenging contrast to the Parfitian and Lockean strategies. The phenomenological lens emphasizes embodiment, lived time, and the pre-reflective sense of self that arises before narrative articulation. This approach invites us to examine how the body, perception, and action co-create the sense of a self in real time. It suggests that identity is not simply a story we assemble from memory and intention, but an ongoing performance of being with others in a shared world. The no-self view adds a further layer. It suggests that our ordinary sense of an enduring core is itself a cognitive construct, a habit of language and experience that can be loosened to reveal a more flexible, relational, and interdependent form of selfhood. If there is no fixed essence to anchor moral life, our ethical field expands. It includes attentiveness to others' needs, the social obligations we bear in common, and the ways in which our own self-conceptions are shaped by intersubjective care. In the end, we aren't asked to decide once and for all whether the self is a stable substance or a flux of impressions. We are asked to attend to the lived consequences of different theories for how we love, forgive, and dare to be responsible in the face of memory's fragility and time's relentless passage. The ship of Theseus can help old and young alike to recognize that change is inevitable, and that what matters is not a stubborn persistence of the same wooden planks, but the continuity of a life's purpose and moral direction. The memory-choked life is not necessarily devoid of identity. It may instead demand new kinds of care, social scaffolding, and therapeutic repair to recover a sense of self-worth and direction. The no-self approach, by loosening the anchor of a stable center, can promote a stance of humility and interdependence, guiding ethical action toward compassionate responsiveness rather than self-centered striving. Yet the no-self approach must not dissolve responsibility into mere social convenience. Rather, it should illuminate the ways in which social and ethical commitments arise from embodied relations and shared practices, making accountability something that can be continuously renewed through mutual recognition and support. In closing this exploration, I want to offer two clarifying observations that connect the threads we have followed to other areas of philosophy and science. First, the question of consciousness and self is inseparable from the question of memory and the cognitive science of continuity. The brain's architecture, how memory traces are formed, stored, and retrieved, how autobiographical memory is reconstructed, how time is experienced subjectively, forms the bedrock for any theory of personal identity. The more we learn about memory and neural encoding, the more we realize that memory is not a pristine thread but a living, editable record, subject to distortion by mood, context, and social input. This recognition should not paralyze moral reasoning. Rather, it should ground it in a realistic picture of human cognition, one in which responsibility is framed in terms of ongoing agency, reliable intention, and the social support structures that sustain memory and future action. Second, the concept of narrative identity expands our ethical imagination. The idea pushing against a purely essential self and embracing the sense that we are ongoing authors of our futures offers a path to growth, forgiveness, and reform. If we read life as a narrative that we continually revise, we can cultivate a sense of moral responsibility that is forward-looking, not merely a retrospective judgment of past acts. We can understand adolescence, trauma, or illness not as simple perturbations of an essential core, but as episodes that require reauthoring, reintegration, and compassionate social response. The story becomes a site of moral action, a place where memory, intention, and social relations intersect to create what we might call a viable self for the future, a self that can learn, adapt, and contribute meaningfully to others' lives. To return to the opening image, the self is indeed dynamic, a narrative we continually retell to ourselves and to others. It can be fragile, tilted by memory lapses, reorganized by brain changes, or open to new ways of living through the practice of self-understanding. It can be coherent, even beautiful, when memory is supported by social trust, when identities survive through the interwoven fabric of relationships, when one's future can be envisioned with a sense of continuity that is not simply a matter of identity numerically, but of purpose, character, and care. And it can be approached with humility from the vantage point of no self, where the insistence on a singular essence yields to an ethical stance of openness and relational responsibility, where the focus shifts from mastering a fixed center to cultivating responsive, compassionate action in the present moment. As we close this section, let us return to a few guiding quotes that anchor the discussions we've engaged, and that remind us why this topic remains so urgent and transformative. From the ancient sources to modern thinkers, the questions remain: what constitutes the same person over time? Does memory secure identity, or might the self be a more spacious, narrative phenomenon? If what matters morally lies in the continuity of our lives rather than a single, unchanging center, how should society structure punishment, rehabilitation, and forgiveness? If there is no fixed self at all, can we still bear responsibility in a meaningful way? The probes are not merely abstract. They ripple through law courts, clinics, classrooms, and households, shaping how we treat one another, how we forgive, and how we help each other to become better versions of ourselves. In the end, the narrative self is not only a hypothesis about mind or memory, it is a practical invitation. To tend our stories with care, to attend to the way memory and memory failure shape our lives, to respect the precariousness and resilience of human identity, and to recognize that the self is a living project, an imperfect, evolving, and collaborative enterprise we create in conversation with others, with the past, and with the future we hope to inhabit. Consciousness has always walked alongside us, shaping the way we live together even when we can barely name what it is we're feeling, thinking, or perceiving. In this segment, we step into the social life of consciousness, how it matters for ethics, law, and public life, and how advances in technology and science are quietly reconfiguring what we think counts as awareness, and what that might count for in a just society. We'll journey from the deep roots of the idea, how philosophers and scientists have wrestled with mind, body, and world, to the edge where minds may become increasingly entangled with machines, patients, policies, and publics. We'll pause to consider embodied in social cognition, animal consciousness, and the provocative, unsettled question of artificial consciousness. We'll look at concrete cases, historical echoes, and the cross-disciplinary threads that knit psychology, neuroscience, philosophy of mind, and ethics into a larger tapestry of public life. Let us begin with origin stories, because any map of consciousness that claims to speak to society must first honor where the idea came from. The history of thinking about consciousness is not a straight line from a philosopher's hat to a laboratory bench. It is an improvisation in dialogue with science, religion, politics, and ordinary experience. In the early modern period, Descartes separated mind and body in a way that still feels stubbornly influential. The mind as a thinking thing, the body as a machine. The famous cogito, "I think therefore I am," is both a guarantee of inward certainty and a provocative demarcation. It invites us to consider consciousness as something intimately linked to self-present experience, but potentially separable from the corporeal world. Yet even as Descartes framed a split between res cogitans and res extensa, other voices insisted that thinking and perceiving are inescapably shaped by the body and its engaged contact with the world. From there, a more integrated picture began to emerge, one that later storytellers would call embodied cognition. This idea does not deny that we think. It says thinking is inseparable from doing, from sensory perception, from the way our limbs and organs participate in gathering information, and from the social and cultural environments that filter and reframe what we notice. A philosopher like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, writing in the mid-20th century, insisted that perception is not a passive receipt of data, but a sign-bearing activity rooted in a living body in a world. The later formal articulation of embodied cognition, with scholars like Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Alina Roche, carried this into laboratory terrain and cognitive theory. Cognition is not a brain on a shelf. It's a brain in a body in a world, the sense in which mind arises from movement through space, from grasping tools, from walking, from the social rhythms of daily life, changed the way philosophers, neuroscientists, and psychologists talk about awareness. If embodiment softens the old mind-body divide, social cognition sharpens the way we think about consciousness as a public phenomenon. We do not live as isolated inner spectators. We live among others whose minds we infer, predict, and respond to. The growth of social cognition, a term that captures how we understand others' beliefs, desires, intentions, and feelings, emerges not only from philosophy but from experiments in psychology, neuroscience, and linguistics. The discovery and description of mirror neurons in the 1990s, work that linked specific brain circuits to the perception and execution of actions, offered a neurological footprint for the old intuition that we understand others by reading their actions and emotions. When a friend smiles, your own facial muscles subconsciously mirror that expression. When someone yawns, you might feel a yawn rising in you. The social world presses on consciousness from the outside in and the inside out in a dynamic reciprocity. Theory of mind, the capacity to attribute mental states to others, becomes not only a folk psychology concept, but a neurological and developmental tale about when and how we learn to navigate shared life. This story naturally leads to a second thread: animal consciousness and moral status. If consciousness is about experience, some aspect of what it is like to feel, perceive, or reflect, then the question of which other creatures possess it, and to what degree, becomes ethically charged. The last century gave us a growing array of empirical evidence that many animals, octopuses with their independent arms, dogs with their nuanced social signaling, crows with problem-solving prowess, dolphins with intricate social lives, exhibit behaviors that look like conscious experience and sophisticated forms of awareness. The debates about whether animals have something like subjective experience and what that implies for how we treat them have never been merely academic. They press directly on law, policy, agriculture, and medicine. If a creature can experience pain or seek relief from distress, then the moral logic of care and avoidance of suffering applies, though how best to articulate and enact that logic is a matter of ongoing disagreement, debate, and refinement. To be sure, the horizon of this conversation expands further when we turn to artificial systems. The near-future questions about machine consciousness are not merely speculative. They are becoming practical in law courts, ethics commissions, corporate boardrooms, and everyday life. What does it mean for a machine to be conscious or to appear conscious, and how would we know? If a system acts with sophisticated understanding, empathy-like responses, and reliable decision-making under uncertainty, does that performance grant it moral consideration? Or must there be something more, an inner experience, a subjective quality that we call consciousness or phenomenal awareness? This set of questions has a long historical spine. It begins with a simple but powerful provocation. Could a machine think? In 1950, the British mathematician and logician Alan Turing offered a provocative reply to that very question in his famous paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. He reframed the question as a test of behavior rather than a private inner life. He proposed the imitation game, a way to operationalize intelligence by focusing on external performance. In his own words, and this is one of his clearest foreshadowings, he asked us to consider whether a machine could persuade a human interlocutor that it is human through conversation. He wrote, "I believe that in about 50 years' time it will be possible to program computers to make them play the imitation game. The proposal is teeming with implications. If behavior, reasoning, language use, and problem-solving can be convincingly like ours, does that not count as a form of intelligence, if not a form of consciousness?" Turing did not claim to prove consciousness. He asked us to imagine an empirical criterion that would settle the matter by demonstration and interaction. The test invites us to think about ethics and rights in terms of observable action and social engagement rather than metaphysical speculations. The invitation to test and compare minds did not go unchallenged. Not long after, in 1980, John Searle offered a counterbalance that has since become one of the most cited philosophical arguments in this domain. His Chinese room thought experiment is, on its face, a very simple scenario. A person who does not understand Chinese sits inside a room, receives Chinese characters, consults a rule book that tells him how to manipulate those symbols, and then outputs appropriate characters in reply. From the outside, the sequence looks like someone who understands Chinese, but inside the room there is no understanding. The point, Searle argued, is not about one person but about the entire system. A machine running a program might appear to understand, but there is no actual understanding, no intentionality, no consciousness behind the symbol manipulation. In one of his compact and often quoted lines, Searle offers a crisp critique. "Syntax without semantics is not sufficient for understanding." The line has become a shorthand for the deeper claim that mere formal rule following, however complex, cannot generate inner experience. These two historical anchors, the Turing test and the Chinese room, frame much of the contemporary debate about consciousness in society and its future. They invite us to ask what counts as understanding, what counts as mind, and what moral status is appropriate for systems that can imitate human cognitive performance. But the conversation did not end with those laboratories or thought experiments. It grew in other directions as well, especially around embodied cognition and early brain mapping, which began to reveal how intimately cognition is tied to the body and to the brain's physical architecture. The mid to late 20th century brought a flood of experiments that pressured the old Cartesian dichotomy. In the realm of embodied cognition, researchers argued that perception, action, and cognitive processing are intimately intertwined with motor systems and sensory-motor experiences. The body is not merely a vessel for a brain, it is a participant in cognitive life. The early brain mapping efforts, pioneered by Wilder Penfield and colleagues, literally drew maps on the cerebral cortex as patients underwent surgical procedures to relieve epilepsy. The sensory and motor homunculi, with their exaggerated body parts, provided a provocative, almost theatrical reminder that the brain's organization is built around the body's needs and capabilities. The echo of that work is still felt today in how we think about the neural basis of consciousness as a distributed, embodied, dynamic phenomenon rather than a solitary seat of the mind. Alongside these empirical currents, the philosophy of mind continued to wrestle with the hard questions. What is consciousness? What could it be like to be another? And what do we owe to beings who might share some of our capacities but differ in essential ways? The hard problem of consciousness, David Chalmers's term for the challenge of explaining why and how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience, began to shape conversations about artificial minds and the ethics of their possible existence. If there is something it is like to be me, and if we extend the same curiosity to non-human animals or potential machines, then the ethical stakes become real. If consciousness matters for experience, for preference satisfaction, and for the right to a life free from pain, then we must consider how societies, laws, and institutions respond to beings who might be conscious in ways that matter to them. In public life, these questions translate into practical and urgent concerns. What obligations do we have toward animals we keep as pets or raise for food? How should researchers treat subjects who might experience pain and distress? What rights, if any, should we grant to intelligent machines or to systems that simulate empathy and social understanding? And how should courts handle the status of software agents, autonomous vehicles, or prosthetic extensions of human agency? In other words, consciousness is not a problem only for philosophers. It becomes a matter of policy, governance, and justice. We can begin to see threads across psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and ethics that illuminate how societies assume or deny consciousness in others. In psychology, the study of social cognition shows us that understanding others is not a detached, purely rational enterprise, but a situated practice shaped by relationships, cultural norms, and the felt presence of other minds. In neuroscience, the discovery of mirrored action and shared circuits suggests that social understanding is rooted in brain mechanisms that enable us to resonate with others' states, to anticipate their actions, and to respond with compassion or caution. In philosophy of mind, the questions about the nature of consciousness, phenomenal experience, intentional states, and the possibility of machine minds force us to clarify what we think counts as moral considerability, what justifies ethical rights, and what limits we place on treatment, integration, or intervention. In ethics, these debates lead to concrete judgments about animal welfare, research protocols, data privacy, algorithmic fairness, and the design of technology that increasingly mediates public life. Let us move from these broad currents towards some concrete questions and examples that illuminate how consciousness intersects with law, ethics, and policy today and in the near future. First, the Turing test and its reinventions in modern AI. Second, debates around animal consciousness and moral status. Third, meditation and neuroethics as ways to cultivate awareness and responsibility. Fourth, near-future AI and the moral question of whether functionally equivalent systems deserve moral consideration. In each case, we will be careful to differentiate what is being claimed, what is being tested, and what remains contested in practice and theory. The Turing test, as a historical touchstone, remains a magnet for both hope and critique. The idea is simple, almost skeletal. If a machine can imitate human responses well enough that a human interlocutor cannot reliably tell whether they are conversing with a machine or a person, the machine has passed. But the beauty and difficulty of Turing's proposal lie in its emphasis on behavior as the primary diagnostic tool. If the external performance is indistinguishable from human action, then the question of inner life becomes less central in the immediate evaluative sense. Yet that very emphasis also invites endless refinements and challenges. In the decades since Turing's paper, scholars and engineers have proposed a variety of reinventions and expansions of the imitation game to address its perceived gaps. One prominent direction is the notion of a total Turing test, which asks not only about conversational competence, but also about a system's perceptual and motor faculties. In a world where intelligent agents operate through not only text, but also vision, touch, speech, and physical interaction with the environment, some argue that a credible test of intelligence or consciousness must include perception and action. We might imagine a robot or avatar that must identify objects in a messy room, respond to physical affordances, and engage in social interaction in real time, all while maintaining coherent and context-appropriate communication. The logic is straightforward. If a system can see, move, and respond to the world as we do, then its cognitive life bears a stronger resemblance to ours, with all the ethical implications that follow. Another line of reinvention centers on the social and emotional dimension of intelligence. Some researchers have proposed a kind of emotional Turing test, in which a machine demonstrates genuine, context-appropriate affective responsiveness not merely by simulating emotion, but by aligning its responses with the human's emotional state in a way that respects their autonomy and agency. This raises the question of whether empathic performance should count toward moral status or moral consideration, and if so, what kind of conditions and safeguards must be in place to prevent manipulation, deception, or the erosion of human dignity through perceived quasi-personhood. A well-known, ongoing real-world platform for testing and public reflection is the Loebner Prize, an annual competition that invites chatbots to engage in conversation with judges and persuade them of their humanity. While the prize has drawn critique, critics argue that it rewards clever wordplay rather than genuine understanding. It remains a potent cultural marker for how far we have drifted in the directions of imitation and social interaction with machines. In parallel, the rise of large language models and multimodal systems has led to practical case studies. How well can a system sustain a long-term, coherent, and ethically sound conversation? How well can it navigate nuanced ethical decisions? And what happens when it encounters the social complexity of deception, bias, or manipulation? These are not purely technical questions. They touch on trust, accountability, and the relationship between human minds and machine minds in the social sphere. When we apply these questions to the moral landscape, two countervailing lines of thought sharpen our analysis. One is functionalism, the claim that what matters for moral status is not inner experience, but outward behavior and functional performance. If a machine behaves in all the morally relevant ways, understands goals, respects boundaries, avoids causing harm, negotiates conflict, and adapts to new social norms, then the moral weight of its decisions, in a public, society-facing sense, becomes comparable to that of a human agent. The logic here is attractive in a world of increasingly capable systems. If the outward effects, the practical outcomes, and the social responsibilities are equivalent, why should the internal ontology of experience be the determining factor? The functionalist line pushes us to design institutions that can evaluate and regulate behavior robustly, perhaps bypassing some of the stubborn metaphysical questions about consciousness in favor of a regulatory and ethical framework anchored in observable consequences. Another counterpoint comes from skeptics who warn against overinterpreting machine performance as evidence of genuine consciousness. Some argue that what looks like understanding can be a sophisticated simulation, an elaborate performance, a stratified program that models expectations, predicts user needs, and behaves in ways that mimic empathy, but without any subjective experience behind the responses. They insist that machine consciousness, if it exists at all, would require a phenomenology that science has yet to demonstrate and may never demonstrate. A related line of critique emphasizes the irreducibility of subjective experience to computation. If there is what it is like to be a conscious agent, as Thomas Nagel famously phrased it in discussing the bat, then the absence of a first-person perspective in a program or robot might forever keep it from true consciousness, regardless of its external competence. The phrase that has become a touchstone in this debate, "What is it like to be a bat?" remains a provocative reminder that experiential perspective is not simply another data stream in the machine's repertoire, but a feature that might be absent in any artificial system. As we weigh these arguments, it is helpful to link the early historical anecdotes to contemporary practice. The Turing test looms large because it invites us to consider the social life of mind through interaction, language, and trust. The Chinese room remains a stubborn challenge to the idea that symbol processing equates to mind, reminding us that intention, understanding, and awareness may be more than the sum of rule following. These two anchors do not settle the matter, but they anchor the debate in a shared memory, one that anchors policy debates about who or what counts as a legitimate agent in society, who can give informed consent, and who must be protected by law and ethical norms. If we turn now to moral and social implications of consciousness for policy and practice, we encounter direct real-world questions. How should we think about the moral status of animals in research, agriculture, and housing? How should we treat intelligent but non-human agents, such as advanced robots or AI companions, that perform social roles in care, education, or customer service? And what is the role of inner experience in public life? How should it factor into what we demand from institutions, from courts, and from regulators when assessing risk, autonomy, and accountability? One crucial domain is animal consciousness and moral status. The debates are not merely rhetorical. They shape veterinary practices, research ethics committees, and welfare policy. The rising body of evidence about animal cognition, octopuses solving complex tasks, corvids planning for the future, dogs understanding human communicative cues and emotions, urges us to consider moral questions about pain, distress, and welfare with greater humility. Some philosophers argue that consciousness, in at least a minimal sense of experience and preference, grounds moral status. If a system or creature can feel pain or desire relief, then we have moral reasons to minimize suffering, to provide for welfare, and to respect basic life interests. Others caution against overextending moral status to all capable agents, urging a careful calibration of rights and duties that are appropriate to the organism's capacities, social roles, and the nature of its experiences. In practice, this translates to policies that address the complexity of welfare. For animals used in laboratories or for food production, it means humane treatment, anesthesia for painful procedures, enrichment in captivity, and transparency in practices. For non-human animals that show advanced cognitive sophistication, like great apes, dolphins, or certain birds, the policy questions grow still more consequential. Should they enjoy higher protections? How do we weigh the ecological and social value of their lives against human interests? And what about our fellow humans who share the planet with these creatures and whose own interests might be overshadowed by animal welfare concerns? These are not abstract debates. They shape regulatory frameworks, research protocols, and agrarian practices in a manner that is inseparable from our evolving view of consciousness as a social and ethical category. Then there's the growing field of neuroethics, which asks not simply what we can do with brain science and neurotechnology, but what we ought to do. If neuroimaging, neural modulation, and brain-computer interfaces begin to alter the fabric of awareness, potentially enhancing memory, attention, or emotion regulation, questions arise about identity, autonomy, privacy, and fairness. How do we regulate the deployment of cognitive enhancement technologies without eroding the dignity and authenticity of human life? How do we safeguard the vulnerable from coercive or exploitative use of neurotechnology in education, employment, or social policy? And what about the possibility that neurotechnologies could alter moral decision-making itself? Neuroethics invites us to think not only about capabilities, but about character, how the technologies we create may participate in shaping our visions of what is good, what justice requires, and what it means to live well with others. This brings us to the near future, the ethical question of whether functionally equivalent AI systems deserve moral consideration. If a future AI behaves indistinguishably from a conscious agent in social contexts, responds to harm in ways that align with human expectations of welfare, and participates in decisions with real consequences for people, should we regard it as morally considerable in the same way we regard a human to be? Some writers and policymakers argue for a cautious extension of moral concern, at least to the level of moral status for beings that exhibit robust, reliable, and sometimes non-trivial social cognition and preferencing behavior. Others urge prudence. We should not bestow moral equality on mere simulacra, because doing so risks diluting the weight of genuine ethical claims, eroding human-centered responsibilities, and confusing the moral calculus with potentially manipulative appearances of agency. In all this, a widely shared insight, though not without caveats, is that minds matter most when they matter to others. If your decisions and actions affect other beings, and if those beings can experience harm, satisfaction, pain, or preference, then the ethical task is to understand those effects and to regulate behavior accordingly. This truth sits at the crossroads of public life, law, policy, education, healthcare, and technology. It invites introspection about how we design systems, how we teach empathy, and how we structure institutions so that they treat consciousness, in all its diverse manifestations, with rigorous care. To illuminate these ideas with concrete examples, let us pause over two that punctuate today's concerns in ways that resonate across disciplines. First, the Turing test and its reinventions in modern AI. Second, debates about animal consciousness and moral status and the implications for policy. A third and fourth thread, meditation and neuroethics and near-future AI and moral considerability, will weave through as well, since they provide practical avenues by which individuals and communities can cultivate awareness and responsibility in the face of powerful technologies. The Turing test is not merely a historical curiosity, it remains a live touchstone for how we evaluate minds in the age of AI. In the simplest terms, the test asks whether a machine can imitate human conversational behavior well enough that a human interlocutor cannot reliably tell whether they are speaking with a machine or a person. But in practice, the test has provoked more questions than it has provided clear answers. It foregrounds public interaction, social perception, and the expectations that shape our judgments of mind. The reinventions extend well beyond the original conversational frame. Some researchers propose the total Turing test, which adds perception and action to the conversational criterion, arguing that authentic intelligence requires more than fluent dialogue. It requires the capacity to perceive, to act, to learn from a real world, and to adapt to it in real time. The logic is not merely to create better chatbots, but to test whether a system can integrate sensory input with motor output in a coordinated fashion that supports meaningful social interaction. In the modern landscape, AI systems demonstrate astonishing prowess in generation, analysis, and problem solving. They can carry out extended conversations, recognize and interpret nuanced cues in language, images, and sounds, and even adapt their responses to the user's goals and preferences. Yet there is a familiar caution in this progress. The surface of competence can be deceptive. We must ask what the internal life of the system is like, if there is any, and what claims we should reasonably make about its personhood, rights, or welfare. The social horizon in which this question unfolds is not a laboratory issue alone. Courts are hearing cases that hinge on ideas about autonomy and responsibility when devices can act with autonomy, or at least with a high degree of procedural independence. In workplaces, AI companions manage tasks, support decision-making, and mediate human relations. In healthcare, AI assistants interpret patient data, propose diagnoses, and guide treatment, often with life-or-death consequences. The Turing tradition thus converges with law, ethics, and public policy as we seek practical criteria for accountability, fairness, and care in technologies that increasingly resemble social agents. The second thread, animal consciousness and moral status, grounds the conversation in the living world we share with other beings. The debate is not merely theoretical. It has practical implications for how we design experiments, how we treat animals in captivity or in the wild, and how we structure industries that depend on animal welfare. It is striking to observe how quickly the conversation broadens when people engage with compelling case studies and experimental results. Consider the octopus, whose suite of problem-solving abilities and adaptive behaviors seems to reveal a form of flexible intelligence strikingly different from our own. Consider dogs and other companion animals, whose responsiveness to human communicative cues and emotional expressions raises questions about the ethical implications of their social roles with humans. And consider corvids and other birds, creatures that have demonstrated remarkable memory, planning, and social complexity under laboratory and field conditions. In each case, the question is not simply whether these animals are conscious in some sense, but whether their lives can and should be ethically weighted in our political and economic decisions. If we accept that there is at least some level of subjective experience that matters to the animal, then we are asked to take seriously their welfare, their preferences, and their right to a life free from unnecessary suffering. The moral calculus expands beyond human exceptionalism, even as it remains contested and context-dependent. This debate interacts with the legal and policy worlds in concrete ways. It informs how we regulate animal experimentation, define humane research standards, allocate resources for animal welfare and farming, and shape public education about non-human minds. It also intersects with debates about animal cognition and the possibility of moral patience, whether we owe creatures certain forms of respect or moral consideration that define our obligations to treat them with dignity. Some theorists argue that we should extend significant moral weight to animals with demonstrable consciousness, while others insist that moral status should track capacities such as self-awareness, reflective reasoning, or social and communicative complexity. There is no simple arithmetic here. It is a nuanced conversation about the kinds of suffering we aim to prevent, the kinds of lives we value, and the ways in which our policies might recognize and respond to non-human experience without overreaching into obligations that would be impracticable or destabilizing for human communities. Moving from animals to human practices, meditation and neuroethics offer a bridge between inner awareness and public responsibility. Mindfulness and related contemplative practices cultivate a form of attentiveness to present experience and a capacity to regulate attention, emotion, and intention. They are not mere personal wellness programs. They have become a potential resource for healthcare, education, and governance, shaping how individuals regulate their cognitive biases, stress responses, and empathic capacities. In a society saturated with data, dashboards, and instantaneous feedback, the discipline of attention matters. It matters because attentiveness shapes how we allocate resources, how we respond to suffering, and how we engage with others in the shared life of public institutions. Neuroethics, meanwhile, foregrounds a different but complementary set of concerns. As neuroscience and neurotechnology advance, we gain tools that might alter memory, mood, decision-making, and even social behavior. The ethical questions become more urgent and more concrete. How do we regulate cognitive enhancements in education or the workplace? How do we protect patient autonomy and privacy in brain imaging, neuromodulation, or brain-computer interfaces? How might these technologies affect social equity, given that access to neuroenhancement could become a new axis of advantage or disadvantage? And what about responsibility when a machine's or a system's decisions are grounded in brain data or in neurobiological signals that reveal vulnerability, bias, or the possibility of manipulation? Neuroethics invites careful governance to ensure that advances in understanding and altering the brain serve human flourishing, while preserving autonomy, consent, and dignity. We should also consider the near-future question of whether functionally equivalent systems deserve moral consideration. If an artificial system can mimic human cognitive processes with high fidelity, if its actions can be integrated into social life with meaningful consequences, if it can act in ways that we value or devalue in others, what follows for its moral status? Some argue that moral status ought to attach not to the mere appearance of behavior, but to the presence of a first-person perspective, a subjective experience that cannot be introspected by using a tool. They emphasize the hard problem: if there is no experience behind the behavior, we should withhold moral claims. Others insist that society already operates with moral criteria that do not hinge on metaphysical certainty about consciousness. Legal agency, rights, and responsibilities often depend on function, reliability, and social recognition, rather than deliberations about inner life. In practice, this means we may need a framework that allows for moral consideration of sophisticated agents in certain contexts, while preserving clear boundaries that protect individuals and communities from manipulation or misrepresentation, and that prevent diluting the seriousness of genuine consciousness. As we choreograph these threads into a single narrative, a few cross-disciplinary crosscurrents deserve special attention. Psychology provides the framework for understanding how we infer others' mental states, how theories of mind develop in childhood, and how social norms shape our expectations of agency and accountability. Neuroscience contributes the empirical findings about brain networks, predictive coding, and the neurobiological correlates of perception, emotion, and action. Philosophy of mind asks whether consciousness is a property of physical processes or something more, whether it requires a subjective point of view, and if that point of view could exist in non-human substrates. Ethics translates all of this into norms for behavior, policy, and law, guiding debates about animal welfare, AI governance, cognitive enhancement, data privacy, and public institutions. The intersection of these domains, psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and ethics, gives us a language for discussing what it would mean to live with intelligent agents who are not purely human, and what moral standing, rights, and duties we owe to them if they begin to inhabit social life with a similar or analogical depth of engagement. To illustrate this further with concrete narratives and primary sources, consider two anchors in the history of thought and two lines of contemporary inquiry. The two anchors remain paradigmatic because they show how a single test or argument can ripple through decades of reflection. The first anchor is Turing's own words, which plant the seed of turning the mind's life into a public demonstration. In his own apparatus of thought, the imitation game is social life has been turned into a criterion for the mind. If you can imitate human conversational behavior well enough, external observers cannot distinguish you from a human. The second anchor is Searle's Chinese room, which remains a sober caution about equating surface performance with inner understanding. The claim that syntax without semantics is not sufficient for understanding remains a crisp warning against conflating intelligent outward signs with inner experience. As we move toward the present, we see a movement away from purely mentalistic concerns toward a more inclusive, more social, and more ethically charged vision of consciousness. The embodied cognition revolution invites us to look at how the brain, the body, and the environment co-create mental life. The social cognition research invites us to recognize that much of what we think we know about others and ourselves is inextricable from social context, language, and cultural norms. The animal cognition literature invites a reformulation of moral communities to include other beings with rich internal lives. The neuroethics domain reminds us that the tools we develop, nerves and algorithms, implants and interfaces, are not neutral. They reshape what it means to be human and what it means to exercise power over life and death. Throughout this journey, a recurring thread is humility. The more we learn about consciousness in ourselves, in other creatures, in machines, the more we see how much is still mysterious. The German philosopher Walter Benjamin once admired the way social life preserves lived experience in communities, in rituals, in education, and in art. In a sense, consciousness becomes a shared project, a public matter to be negotiated among citizens, scholars, lawmakers, clinicians, and engineers. If we are to live well in a society where minds are increasingly interwoven with technology and with other minds, we need to cultivate a vocabulary that can honor both the depth of subjective experience and the prudence required in design, governance, and policy. To reinforce this, I would like to offer two bright quotes from primary sources that anchor our reflection, reminding us of the human stakes in these debates. First, the early, clarifying voice of Turing. I believe that in about 50 years' time it will be possible to program computers to make them play the imitation game. A sentence that sounds simple, but which opens a century-long conversation about what counts as thought, what counts as life, and what social meaning we attach to the appearance of intelligence. Second, the crisp, grounded warning from Husserl: syntax without semantics is not sufficient for understanding. A reminder that, as we build machines that speak and act with ever greater sophistication, we must keep ourselves honest about what 4 lines of code or a neural network actually feel like to a mind, and whether a mind has become something more than a useful instrument. And to anchor philosophy in timeless human reflection, consider Descartes' own absolute, the line that many still echo in public life: I think, therefore I am. Not as a metaphysical proof that consciousness is single and separable from the body, but as a reminder of the first-person standpoint at the heart of our experience, the seed from which all public discourse about mind, ethics, and society grows. There is also a smaller, often overlooked, but deeply telling anecdote from the middle of the 20th century, the era of brain mapping and perception experiments that quietly reoriented how we conceive of minds. Wilder Penfield, operating in the 1930s to 1950s, mapped the brain's sensory and motor cortex by stimulating brain tissue during surgical procedures, eliciting sensations and movements that could be precisely correlated with regions of the cortex. The patient's awareness of a body part moving or a sensory experience triggered by stimulation provided a powerfully concrete picture of the brain as a map of the body's lived experience. It turns the abstract into the tactile. How consciousness unfolds is intimately tied to a brain's spatial arrangement and an organism's ability to interact with a world that is both physical and social. Later in the same century, embodied cognition researchers emphasized that perception and action are deeply interwoven with the environment, challenging the idea that cognition happens in a vacuum. The brain's activity, rather than being an isolated command center, participated in a dynamic loop with the world, the body, the tools we use, the spaces we inhabit, and the communities to which we belong. These threads show us that consciousness in society cannot be reduced to a single test or a single argument. It is a web of questions about what we are, what we owe to others, and how technology changes the terms of responsibility. In the courtroom, this translates into standards for accountability when AI participates in decisions with consequences for liberty and safety. In clinics, it translates into how we think about patient autonomy in the presence of neurotechnologies that could alter memory or mood. In classrooms and workplaces, it shapes how we teach, how we evaluate, and how we treat the vulnerable with care and dignity when new cognitive tools become integral to daily life. In policy and law, it anchors debates about rights, whether rights extend to non-human animals, to intelligent machines, to digital agents, and what duties we owe to beings whose conscious lives are difficult to observe directly, but whose effects on others are real and traceable. To keep this discussion moving forward in a thoughtful, reflective way, I'll end with a brief look toward the future, a tempered sense of what it would mean to live wisely with consciousness in society and with technology. The future will likely bring increasingly sophisticated interactions with systems that can simulate nuance, respond with social sensitivity, and act with a degree of autonomy that challenges traditional boundaries between agent and tool. The ethical priority will be the cultivation of awareness, not only awareness of the other's situation and suffering, but awareness of how our own cognitive habits, biases, and emotional responses shape our policies. We will need to nurture critical thinking, empathy, and humility in equal measure, a combination that can help us design governance frameworks, educational systems, and public discourse that honor diverse forms of experience while remaining vigilant about the risks of manipulation, coercion, and misrepresentation. In the end, the question is not whether consciousness can be engineered to mimic ours perfectly, or whether there is a private qualitative life behind every silicon ripple. The question is whether our public life, our laws, our institutions, our shared sense of what it means to be a person among others, can be redesigned to accommodate a broader and more plural landscape of awareness. If we learn to listen to the possible sentiences around us, whether in animals, in evolving AI systems, or in the quiet, embodied, social life of human beings, we may find a richer, more responsible way to live together. Consciousness in society and in the future asks us to imagine not just new technologies, but new forms of care, accountability, and belonging. As we continue this exploration in the next segment, we will dive more deeply into specific cases and legal ethical frameworks that current societies are developing. We will examine how policies are being shaped by the twin aims of protecting welfare and promoting innovation, how courts interpret the status of intelligent agents, how educators think about cognitive enhancement and mindfulness, and how ordinary citizens can cultivate a mindful, ethical stance toward technologies that increasingly mediate our understanding of other minds. We will return to the core intuition that runs through all these questions. Consciousness matters not only because it is a private treasure, but because it has public consequences, and because our handling of those consequences will reveal what kind of society we choose to be.